Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 11. The Round of Life. Anne was back in Avonlea with the lustre of the Thorburn scholarship on her brow. People told her she hadn't changed much, in a tone which hinted they were surprised and a little disappointed she hadn't. Avonlea had not changed either, at least, so it seemed at first. But as Anne sat in the Green Gables pew on the first Sunday after her return and looked over the congregation, she saw several little changes which, all coming home to her at once, made her realize that time did not quite stand still, even in Avonlea. A new minister was in the pulpit. In the pews, more than one familiar face was missing forever. Old Uncle Abe, his prophesying over and done with, Mrs. Peter Sloane, who had sighed, it was to be hoped, for the last time, Timothy Cotton, who, as Mrs. Rachel Lynde said, had actually managed to die at last after practising at it for 20 years, and old Josiah Sloane, whom nobody knew in his coffin because he had his whiskers neatly trimmed, were all sleeping in the little graveyard behind the church. And Billy Andrews was married to Nettie Blewett. They appeared out that Sunday. When Billy, beaming with pride and happiness, showed his beplumed and besilked bride into the Harmon Andrews pew, Anne dropped her lids to hide her dancing eyes. She recalled the stormy winter night of the Christmas holidays when Jane had proposed for Billy. He certainly had not broken his heart over his rejection. Anne wondered if Jane had also proposed to Nettie for him, or if he had mustered enough spunk to ask the fateful question himself. All the Andrews family seemed to share in his pride and pleasure, from Mrs. Harmon in the pew to Jane in the choir. Jane had resigned from the Avonlea school and intended to go west in the fall. "Can't get a beau in Avonlea, that's what," said Mrs. Rachel Lynde scornfully. "Says she thinks she'll have better health out west. I never heard her health was poor before." "Jane is a nice girl," Anne had said loyally. "She never tried to attract attention as some did." "Oh, she never chased the boys, if that's what you mean," said Mrs. Rachel. "But she'd like to be married, just as much as anybody, that's what. What else would take her out west to some forsaken place whose only recommendation is that men are plenty and women scarce? Don't you tell me." But it was not at Jane Anne gazed that day in dismay and surprise. It was at Ruby Gillis, who sat beside her in the choir. What had happened to Ruby? She was even handsomer than ever, but her blue eyes were too bright and lustrous, and the color of her cheeks was hectically brilliant. Besides, she was very thin. The hands that held her hymn-book were almost transparent in their delicacy. "Is Ruby Gillis ill?" Anne asked of Mrs. Lynde as they went home from church. "Ruby Gillis is dying of galloping consumption," said Mrs. Lynde bluntly. "Everybody knows it except herself and her family. They won't give in. If you ask them, she's perfectly well. She hasn't been able to teach since she had that attack of congestion in the winter, but she says she's going to teach again in the fall, and she's after the White Sands School. She'll be in her grave, poor girl, when White Sands School opens, that's what." Anne listened in shocked silence. Ruby Gillis, her old school chum, dying? Could it be possible? Of late years they had grown apart, but the old tie of schoolgirl intimacy was there, and made itself felt sharply in the tug the news gave at Anne's heartstrings. Ruby, the brilliant, the merry, the coquettish. It was impossible to associate the thought of her with anything like death. She had greeted Anne with gay cordiality after church, and urged her to come up the next evening. "I'll be away Tuesday and Wednesday evenings," she had whispered triumphantly. "There's a concert at Carmody and a party at White Sands. Herb Spencer is going to take me. He's my latest. Be sure to come up tomorrow. I'm dying for a good talk with you. I want to hear all about your doings at Redmond." Anne knew that Ruby meant that she wanted to tell Anne all about her own recent flirtations, but she promised to go, and Diana offered to go with her. "I've been wanting to go see Ruby for a long while," she told Anne when they left Green Gables the next evening, "but I really couldn't go alone. It's so awful to hear Ruby rattling on as she does, and pretending there is nothing the matter with her, even when she can hardly speak for coughing. She's fighting so hard for her life, and yet she hasn't any chance at all, they say." The girls walked silently down the red twilit road. The robins were singing vespers in the high tree-tops, filling the golden air with their jubilant voices. The silver fluting of the frogs came from marshes and ponds, over fields where seeds were beginning to stir with life and thrill to the sunshine and rain that had drifted over them. The air was fragrant with the wild, sweet, wholesome smell of young raspberry copses. White mists were hovering in the silent hollows, and violet stars were shining bluely on the brooklands. "What a beautiful sunset," said Diana. "Look, Anne, it's just like a land in itself, isn't it? That long, low back of purple cloud is the shore, and the clear sky further on is like a golden sea. If we could sail to it in the moonshine boat Paul wrote of in his old composition, you remember, how nice it would be," said Anne, rousing from her reverie. "Do you think we could find all our yesterdays there, Diana? All our old springs and blossoms? The beds of flowers that Paul saw there are the roses that have bloomed for us in the past?" "Don't," said Diana. "You make me feel as if we were old women with everything in life behind us." "I think I've almost felt as if we were since I heard about poor Ruby," said Anne. "If it is true that she is dying, any other sad thing might be true too." "You don't mind calling in at Elisha Wright's for a moment, do you?" asked Diana. "Mother asked me to leave this little dish of jelly for Aunt Atossa." "Who is Aunt Atossa?" "Oh, haven't you heard? She's Mrs. Samson Coates of Spencervale, Mrs. Elisha Wright's aunt. She's father's aunt, too. Her husband died last winter, and she was left very poor and lonely, so the Wrights took her to live with them. Mother thought we ought to take her, but father put his foot down. Live with Aunt Atossa he would not." "Is she so terrible?" asked Anne absently. "You'll probably see what she's like before we can get away," said Diana significantly. "Father says she has a face like a hatchet. It cuts the air. But her tongue is sharper still." Late as it was, Aunt Atossa was cutting potato sets in the Wright kitchen. She wore a faded old wrapper, and her grey hair was decidedly untidy. Aunt Atossa did not like being caught in a kilter, so she went out of her way to be disagreeable. "Oh, so you're Anne Shirley," she said, when Diana introduced Anne. "I've heard of you." Her tone implied that she had heard nothing good. "Mrs. Andrews was telling me you were home. She said you had improved a good deal." There was no doubt Aunt Atossa thought there was plenty of room for further improvement. She ceased not from cutting sets with much energy. "Is it any use to ask you to sit down?" she inquired sarcastically. "Of course, there's nothing very entertaining here for you. The rest are all away." "Mother sent you this little pot of rhubarb jelly," said Diana pleasantly. "She made it today and thought you might like some." "Oh, thanks," said Aunt Atossa sourly. "I never fancy your mother's jelly. She always makes it too sweet. However, I'll try to worry some down. My appetite's been dreadful poor this spring. I'm far from well," continued Aunt Atossa solemnly, "but still I keep a-doing. People who can't work aren't wanted here. If it isn't too much trouble, will you be condescending enough to set the jelly in the pantry? I'm in a hurry to get these spuds done tonight. I suppose you two ladies never do anything like this. You'd be afraid of spoiling your hands." "I used to cut potato sets before we rented the farm," smiled Anne. "I do it yet," laughed Diana. "I cut sets 3 days last week. Of course," she added teasingly, "I did my hands up in lemon juice and kid gloves every night after it." Aunt Atossa sniffed. "I suppose you got that notion out of some of those silly magazines you read so much of. I wonder your mother allows you, but she always spoiled you. We all thought when George married her she wouldn't be a suitable wife for him." Aunt Atossa sighed heavily, as if all forebodings upon the occasions of George Barry's marriage had been amply and darkly fulfilled. "Going, are you?" she inquired as the girls rose. "Well, I suppose you can't find much amusement talking to an old woman like me. It's such a pity the boys ain't home." "We want to run in and see Ruby Gillis a little while," explained Diana. "Oh, anything does for an excuse, of course," said Aunt Atossa amiably. "Just whip in and whip out before you have time to say how do decently. It's college airs, I suppose. You'd be wiser to keep away from Ruby Gillis. The doctors say consumption's catching. I always knew Ruby'd get something, gadding off to Boston last fall for a visit. People who ain't content to stay home always catch something." "People who don't go visiting catch things too. Sometimes they even die," said Diana solemnly. "Then they don't have themselves to blame for it," retorted Aunt Atossa triumphantly. "I hear you were to be married in June, Diana." "There is no truth in that report," said Diana, blushing. "Well, don't put it off too long," said Aunt Atossa significantly. "You'll fade soon. You're all complexion and hair. And the Wrights are terrible fickle. You ought to wear a hat, Miss Shirley. Your nose is freckling scandalous. My, but you are red-headed. Well, I suppose we're all as the Lord made us. Give Marilla Cuthbert my respects. She's never been to see me since I come to Avonlea, but I suppose I oughtn't to complain. The Cuthberts always did think themselves a cut higher than anyone else around here." "Oh, isn't she dreadful?" gasped Diana as they escaped down the lane. "She's worse than Miss Eliza Andrews," said Anne. "But then think of living all your life with a name like Atossa. Wouldn't it sour almost anyone? She should have tried to imagine her name was Cordelia. It might have helped her a great deal. It certainly helped me in the days when I didn't like Anne." "Josie Pye will be just like her when she grows up," said Diana. "Josie's mother and Aunt Atossa are cousins, you know. Oh dear, I'm glad that's over. She's so malicious. She seems to put a bad flavor in everything. Father tells such a funny story about her. One time they had a minister in Spencervale who was a very good, spiritual man, but very deaf. He couldn't hear any ordinary conversation at all. Well, they used to have a prayer meeting on Sunday evenings, and all the church members present would get up and pray in turn, or say a few words on some Bible verse. But one evening Aunt Atossa bounced up. She didn't either pray or preach. Instead, she lit into everybody else in the church and gave them a fearful raking down, calling them right out by name, and telling them how they all had behaved, and casting up all the quarrels and scandals of the past 10 years. Finally, she wound up by saying that she was disgusted with Spencervale Church, and she never meant to darken its door again, and she hoped a fearful judgment would come upon it. Then she sat down, out of breath, and the minister, who hadn't heard a word she said, immediately remarked in a very devout voice, "Amen. The Lord grant our dear sister's prayer." You ought to hear Father tell the story. "Speaking of stories, Diana," remarked Anne in a significant, confidential tone, "do you know that lately I've been wondering if I could write a short story, a story that would be good enough to be published?" "Why, of course you could," said Diana, after she had grasped the amazing suggestion. "You used to write perfectly thrilling stories years ago in our old story club." "Well, I hardly meant one of that kind of stories," smiled Anne. "I've been thinking about it a little of late, but I'm almost afraid to try, for if I should fail, it would be too humiliating. I heard Priscilla say once that all Mrs. Morgan's first stories were rejected, but I'm sure yours wouldn't be, Anne, for it's likely editors have more sense nowadays. Margaret Burton, one of the junior girls at Redmond, wrote a story last winter, and it was published in the Canadian Woman. I really do think I could write one at least as good. And will you have it published in the Canadian Woman?" "I might try one of the bigger magazines first. It all depends on what kind of a story I write." "What is it to be about?" "I don't know yet. I want to get hold of a good plot. I believe this is very necessary from an editor's point of view. The only thing I've settled on is the heroine's name. It is to be Averil Lester. Rather pretty, don't you think? Don't mention this to anyone, Diana. I haven't told anybody but you and Mr. Harrison. He wasn't very encouraging. He said there was far too much trash written nowadays as it was, and he'd expected something better of me after a year at college." "What does Mr. Harrison know about it?" demanded Diana scornfully. They found the Gillis home gay with lights and callers. Leonard Kimball of Spencervale and Morgan Bell of Carmody were glaring at each other across the parlor. Several merry girls had dropped in. Ruby was dressed in white, and her eyes and cheeks were very brilliant. She laughed and chattered incessantly, and after the other girls had gone, she took Anne upstairs to display her new summer dresses. "I've a blue silk to make up yet, but it's a little heavy for summer wear. I think I'll leave it until the fall. I'm going to teach in White Sands, you know. How do you like my hat? That one you had on in church yesterday was real dinky, but I like something brighter for myself. Did you notice those two ridiculous boys downstairs? They've both come determined to sit each other out. I don't care a single bit about either of them, you know. Herb Spencer is the one I like. Sometimes I really do think he's Mr. Right. At Christmas I thought the Spencervale schoolmaster was that, but I found out something about him that turned me against him. He nearly went insane when I turned him down. I wish those two boys hadn't come tonight. I wanted to have a nice good talk with you, Anne, and tell you such heaps of things. You and I were always good chums, weren't we?" Ruby slipped her arm about Anne's waist with a shallow little laugh. But just for a moment their eyes met, and behind all the luster of Ruby's, Anne saw something that made her heart ache. "Come up often, won't you, Anne?" whispered Ruby. "Come alone. I want you." "Are you feeling quite well, Ruby?" "Me? Why, I'm perfectly well. I never felt better in my life. Of course that congestion last winter pulled me down a little, but just see my color. I don't look much like an invalid, I'm sure." Ruby's voice was almost sharp. She pulled her arm away from Anne as if in resentment, and ran downstairs, where she was gayer than ever, apparently so much absorbed in bantering her two swains that Diana and Anne felt rather out of it, and soon went away. Chapter 11. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 12. Averil's Atonement. "What are you dreaming of, Anne?" The two girls were loitering one evening in a fairy hollow of the brook. Ferns nodded in it, and little grasses were green, and wild pears hung finely scented white curtains around it. Anne roused herself from her reverie with a happy sigh. "I was thinking out my story, Diana." "Oh, have you really begun it?" cried Diana, all alight with eager interest in a moment. "Yes. I have only a few pages written, but I have it all pretty well thought out. I've had such a time to get a suitable plot. None of the plots that suggested themselves suited a girl named Avril. Couldn't you have changed her name? No, the thing was impossible. I tried to, but I couldn't do it, any more than I could change yours. Avril was so real to me that no matter what other name I tried to give her, I just thought of her as Avril behind it all. But finally I got a plot that matched her. Then came the excitement of choosing names for all my characters. You have no idea how fascinating that is. I've lain awake for hours thinking over those names. The hero's name is Percival Dalrymple. Have you named all the characters? Asked Diana wistfully. If you hadn't, I was going to ask you to let me name one, just some unimportant person. I'd feel as if I had a share in the story then. You may name the little hired boy who lived with the Lesters, conceded Anne. He is not very important, but he is the only one left unnamed. Call him Raymond Fitzosborne, suggested Diana, who had a store of such names laid away in her memory, relics of the old Story Club, which she and Anne and Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis had had in their schooldays. Anne shook her head doubtfully. I'm afraid that is too aristocratic a name for a chore boy, Diana. I couldn't imagine a Fitzosborne feeding pigs and picking up chips, could you? Diana didn't see why, if you had an imagination at all, you couldn't stretch it to that extent, but probably Anne knew best, and the chore boy was finally christened Robert Ray, to be called Bobby should occasion require. How much do you suppose you'll get for it? Asked Diana. But Anne had not thought about this at all. She was in pursuit of fame, not filthy lucre, and her literary dreams were as yet untainted by mercenary considerations. "You'll let me read it, won't you?" pleaded Diana. "When it is finished, I'll read it to you and Mr. Harrison, and I shall want you to criticize it severely. No one else shall see it until it is published." "How are you going to end it, happily or unhappily?" "I'm not sure. I'd like it to end unhappily, because that would be so much more romantic, but I understand editors have a prejudice against sad endings. I heard Professor Hamilton say once that nobody but a genius should try to write an unhappy ending, and," concluded Anne modestly, "I am anything but a genius." "Oh, I like happy endings best. You'd better let him marry her," said Diana, who, especially since her engagement to Fred, thought this was how every story should end. "But you like to cry over stories." "Oh, yes, in the middle of them, but I like everything to come out right at last." "I must have one pathetic scene in it," said Anne thoughtfully. "I might let Robert Ray be injured in an accident and have a death scene." "No, you mustn't kill Bobby off," declared Diana, laughing. "He belongs to me, and I want him to live and flourish. Kill somebody else if you have to." For the next fortnight Anne writhed or revelled, according to mood, in her literary pursuits. Now she would be jubilant over a brilliant idea, now despairing because some contrary character would not behave properly. Diana could not understand this. "Make them do as you want them to," she said. "I can't," mourned Anne. "Avril is such an unmanageable heroine. She will do and say things I never meant her to. Then that spoils everything that went before, and I have to write it all over again." Finally, however, the story was finished, and Anne read it to Diana in the seclusion of the porch gable. She had achieved her pathetic scene without sacrificing Robert Ray, and she kept a watchful eye on Diana as she read it. Diana rose to the occasion and cried properly, but when the end came she looked a little disappointed. "Why did you kill Maurice Lennox?" she asked reproachfully. "He was the villain," protested Anne. "He had to be punished." "I like him best of them all," said unreasonable Diana. "Well, he's dead, and he'll have to stay dead," said Anne rather resentfully. "If I'd let him live he'd have gone on persecuting Avril and Percival." "Yes, unless you had reformed him." "That wouldn't have been romantic, and besides, it would have made the story too long." "Well, anyway, it's a perfectly elegant story, Anne, and will make you famous, of that I'm sure. Have you got a title for it?" "Oh, I decided on the title long ago. I'll call it Avril's Atonement. Doesn't that sound nice and alliterative? Now, Diana, tell me candidly, do you see any faults in my story?" "Well," hesitated Diana, "that part where Avril makes the cake doesn't seem to me quite romantic enough to match the rest. It's just what anybody might do. Heroines shouldn't do cooking, I think." "Why, that is where the humor comes in, and it is one of the best parts of the whole story," said Anne, and it may be stated that in this she was quite right. Diana prudently refrained from any further criticism, but Mr. Harrison was much harder to please. First he told her there was entirely too much description in the story. "Cut out all those flowery passages," he said unfeelingly. Anne had an uncomfortable conviction that Mr. Harrison was right, and she forced herself to expunge most of her beloved descriptions, though it took 3 rewritings before the story could be pruned down to please the fastidious Mr. Harrison. "I've left out all the descriptions but the sunset," she said at last. I simply couldn't let it go. It was the best of them all." "It hasn't anything to do with the story," said Mr. Harrison, "and you shouldn't have laid the scene among rich city people. What do you know of them? Why didn't you lay it right here in Avonlea? Changing the name, of course, or else Mrs. Rachel Lynde would probably think she was the heroine." "Oh, that would never have done," protested Anne. "Avonlea is the dearest place in the world, but it isn't quite romantic enough for the scene of a story." "I dare say there's been many a romance in Avonlea, and many a tragedy, too," said Mr. Harrison dryly. "But your folks ain't like real folks anywhere. They talk too much and use too high-flown language. There's one place where that Dalrymple chap talks even on for 2 pages, and never lets the girl get a word in edgewise. If he'd done that in real life, she'd have pitched him." "I don't believe it," said Anne flatly. In her secret soul she thought that the beautiful, poetical things said to Averil would win any girl's heart completely. Besides, it was gruesome to hear of Averil, the stately, queen-like Averil, pitching anyone. Averil declined her suitors. "Anyhow," resumed the merciless Mr. Harrison, "I don't see why Maurice Lennox didn't get her. He was twice the man the other is. He did bad things, but he did them. Percival hadn't time for anything but mooning." "Mooning? That was even worse than pitching." "Maurice Lennox was the villain," said Anne indignantly. "I don't see why everyone likes him better than Percival." "Percival is too good. He's aggravating. Next time you write about a hero, put a little spice of human nature in him." "Averil couldn't have married Maurice. He was bad." "She'd have reformed him. You can reform a man. You can't reform a jellyfish, of course. Your story isn't bad. It's kind of interesting, I'll admit. But you're too young to write a story that would be worthwhile. Wait 10 years. Anne made up her mind that the next time she wrote a story she wouldn't ask anybody to criticize it. It was too discouraging. She would not read the story to Gilbert, although she told him about it. "If it is a success, you'll see it when it's published, Gilbert. But if it is a failure, nobody shall ever see it." Marilla knew nothing about the venture. In imagination Anne saw herself reading a story out of a magazine to Marilla, entrapping her into praise of it, for in imagination all things are possible, and then triumphantly announcing herself the author. One day Anne took to the post office a long, bulky envelope, addressed, with the delightful confidence of youth and inexperience, to the very biggest of the big magazines. Diana was as excited over it as Anne herself. "How long do you suppose it will be before you hear from it?" she asked. "It shouldn't be longer than a fortnight. Oh, how happy and proud I shall be if it is accepted." "Of course it will be accepted, and they will likely ask you to send them more. You may be as famous as Mrs. Morgan one day, Anne, and then how proud I'll be of knowing you," said Diana, who possessed at least the striking merit of an unselfish admiration of the gifts and graces of her friends. A week of delightful dreaming followed, and then came a bitter awakening. One evening Diana found Anne in the porch gable, with suspicious-looking eyes. On the table lay a long envelope and a crumpled manuscript. "And your story hasn't come back?" cried Diana incredulously. "Yes, it has," said Anne shortly. "Well, that editor must be crazy. What reason did he give?" "No reason at all. There is just a printed slip saying that it wasn't found acceptable." "I never thought much of that magazine anyway," said Diana hotly. "The stories in it are not half as interesting as those in the Canadian Woman, although it costs so much more. I suppose the editor is prejudiced against anyone who isn't a Yankee. Don't be discouraged, Anne. Remember how Mrs. Morgan's stories came back. Send yours to the Canadian Woman." "I believe I will," said Anne, plucking up heart. "And if it is published I'll send that American editor a marked copy. But I'll cut the sunset out. I believe Mr. Harrison was right." Out came the sunset. But in spite of this heroic mutilation, the editor of the Canadian Woman sent Averil's atonement back so promptly that the indignant Diana declared that it couldn't have been read at all, and vowed she was going to stop her subscription immediately. Anne took this second rejection with the calmness of despair. She locked the story away in the garret trunk where the old Story Club tales reposed, but first she yielded to Diana's entreaties and gave her a copy. "This is the end of my literary ambitions," she said bitterly. She never mentioned the matter to Mr. Harrison, but one evening he asked her bluntly if her story had been accepted. "No, the editor wouldn't take it," she answered briefly. Mr. Harrison looked sideways at the flushed, delicate profile. "Well, I suppose you'll keep on writing them," he said encouragingly. "No, I shall never try to write a story again," declared Anne with the hopeless finality of 19, when a door is shut in its face. "I wouldn't give up altogether," said Mr. Harrison reflectively. "I'd write a story once in a while, but I wouldn't pester editors with it. I'd write of people and places like I knew, and I'd make my characters talk everyday English. and I'd let the sun rise and set in the usual quiet way without much fuss over the fact. If I had to have villains at all, I'd give 'em a chance, Anne. I'd give 'em a chance. There are some terrible bad men in the world, I suppose, but you'd have to go a long piece to find them, though Mrs. Lynde believes we're all bad. But most of us have got a little decency somewhere in us. Keep on writing, Anne." "No. It was very foolish of me to attempt it. When I'm through Redmond I'll stick to teaching. I can teach. I can't write stories." "It'll be time for you to be getting a husband when you're through Redmond," said Mr. Harrison. "I don't believe in putting marrying off too long, like I did." Anne got up and marched home. There were times when Mr. Harrison was really intolerable. Pitching, mooning, and getting a husband. Ow! End of chapter 12. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 13. The Way of Transgressors. Davy and Dora were ready for Sunday school. They were going alone, which did not often happen, for Mrs. Lynde always attended Sunday school. But Mrs. Lynde had twisted her ankle and was lame, and so she was staying home this morning. The twins were also to represent the family at church, for Anne had gone away the evening before to spend Sunday with friends in Carmody, and Marilla had one of her headaches. Davy came downstairs slowly. Dora was waiting in the hall for him, having been made ready by Mrs. Lynde. Davy had attended to his own preparations. He had a cent in his pocket for the Sunday school collection, and a 5-cent piece for the church collection. He carried his Bible in one hand and his Sunday school quarterly in the other. He knew his lesson and his golden text and his catechism question perfectly. Had he not studied them, perforce, in Mrs. Lynde's kitchen all last Sunday afternoon? Davy therefore should have been in a placid state of mind. As a matter of fact, despite text and catechism, he was inwardly as a ravening wolf. Mrs. Lynde limped out of her kitchen as he joined Dora. "Are you clean?" she demanded severely. "Yes, all of me that shows," Davy answered with a defiant scowl. Mrs. Rachel sighed. She had her suspicions about Davy's neck and ears, but she knew that if she attempted to make a personal examination Davy would likely take to his heels, and she could not pursue him today. "Well, be sure you behave yourselves," she warned them. "Don't walk in the dust. Don't stop in the porch to talk to the other children. Don't squirm or wriggle in your places. Don't forget the golden text. Don't lose your collection or forget to put it in. Don't whisper at prayer time. And don't forget to pay attention to the sermon." Davy deigned no response. He marched away down the lane, followed by the meek Dora, but his soul seethed within. Davy had suffered, or thought he had suffered, many things at the hands and tongue of Mrs. Rachel Lynde since she had come to Green Gables, for Mrs. Lynde could not live with anybody, whether they were 9 or 90, without trying to bring them up properly. And it was only the preceding afternoon that she had interfered to influence Marilla against allowing Davy to go fishing with the Timothy Cottons. Davy was still boiling over this. As soon as he was out of the lane, Davy stopped and twisted his countenance into such an unearthly and terrific contortion that Dora, although she knew his gifts in that respect, was honestly alarmed lest he should never in the world be able to get it straightened out again. "Darn her!" exploded Davy. "Oh, Davy, don't swear!" gasped Dora in dismay. "Darn isn't swearing, not real swearing. And I don't care if it is," retorted Davy recklessly. "Well, if you must say dreadful words, don't say them on Sunday," pleaded Dora. Davy was as yet far from repentance, but in his secret soul he felt that perhaps he had gone a little too far. "I'm going to invent a swear word of my own," he declared. "God will punish you if you do," said Dora solemnly. "Then I think God is a mean old scamp," retorted Davy. "Doesn't he know a fellow must have some way of 'spressing his feelings?" "Davy," said Dora. She expected that Davy would be struck down dead on the spot. But nothing happened. "Anyway, I ain't going to stand any more of Mrs. Lynde's bossing," spluttered Davy. "Anne and Marilla may have the right to boss me, but she hasn't. I'm going to do every single thing she told me not to do. You watch me." In grim, deliberate silence, while Dora watched him with the fascination of horror, Davy stepped off the green grass of the roadside, ankle-deep into the fine dust which 4 weeks of rainless weather had made on the road, and marched along in it, shuffling his feet viciously until he was enveloped in a hazy cloud. "That's the beginning," he announced triumphantly. "And I'm going to stop in the porch and talk as long as there's anybody there to talk to. I'm going to squirm and wriggle and whisper, and I'm going to say I don't know the golden text, and I'm going to throw away both of my collections right now." And Davy hurled cent and nickel over Mr. Barry's fence with fierce delight. "Satan made you do that," said Dora reproachfully. "He didn't," cried Davy indignantly. "I just thought it out for myself. And I've thought of something else. I'm not going to go to Sunday school or church at all. I'm going up to play with the Cottons. They told me yesterday they weren't going to Sunday school today 'cause their mother was away and there was nobody to make 'em. Come along, Dora. We'll have a great time." "I don't want to go," protested Dora. "You've got to," said Davy. "If you don't come, I'll tell Marilla that Frank Bell kissed you in school last Monday." "I couldn't help it. I didn't know he was going to," cried Dora, blushing scarlet. "Well, you didn't slap him or seem a bit cross," retorted Davy. "I'll tell her that, too, if you don't come. We'll take the short cut up this field." "I'm afraid of those cows," protested poor Dora, seeing a prospect of escape. "The very idea of your being scared of those cows," scoffed Davy. "Why, they're both younger than you." "They're bigger," said Dora. "They won't hurt you. Come along now. This is great. When I grow up, I ain't going to bother going to church at all. I believe I can get to heaven by myself." "You'll go to the other place if you break the Sabbath day," said unhappy Dora, following him sorely against her will. But Davy was not scared. Yet. Hell was very far off, and the delights of a fishing expedition with the Cottons were very near. He wished Dora had more spunk. She kept looking back as if she were going to cry every minute, and that spoiled a fellow's fun. Hang girls, anyway. Davy did not say darn this time, even in thought. He was not sorry yet that he had said it once, but it might be as well not to tempt the unknown powers too far on one day. The small Cottons were playing in their backyard, and hailed Davy's appearance with whoops of delight. Pete, Tommy, Adolphus, and Mirabel Cotton were all alone. Their mother and older sisters were away. Dora was thankful Mirabel was there, at least. She had been afraid she would be alone in a crowd of boys. Mirabel was almost as bad as a boy. She was so noisy and sunburned and reckless, but at least she wore dresses. "We've come to go fishing," announced Davy. "Woo!" yelled the Cottons. They rushed away to dig worms at once, Mirabel leading the van with a tin can. Dora could have sat down and cried. Oh, if only that hateful Frank Bell had never kissed her! Then she could have defied Davy and gone to her beloved Sunday school. They dared not, of course, go fishing on the pond, where they would be seen by people going to church. They had to resort to the brook in the woods behind the Cotton house, but it was full of trout, and they had a glorious time that morning. At least, the Cottons certainly had, and Davy seemed to have it. Not being entirely bereft of prudence, he had discarded boots and stockings and borrowed Tommy Cotton's overalls. Thus accoutered, bog and marsh and undergrowth had no terrors for him. Dora was frankly and manifestly miserable. She followed the others in their peregrinations from pool to pool, clasping her Bible and Quarterly tightly, and thinking with bitterness of soul of her beloved class, where she would be sitting that very moment before a teacher she adored. Instead, here she was, roaming the woods with those half-wild Cottons, trying to keep her boots clean and her pretty white dress free from rents and stains. Mirabel had offered the loan of an apron, but Dora had scornfully refused. The trout bit, as they always do on Sundays. In an hour the transgressors had all the fish they wanted, so they returned to the house, much to Dora's relief. She sat primly on a hen-coop in the yard while the others played an uproarious game of tag, and then they all climbed to the top of the pig-house roof and cut their initials on the saddle-board. The flat-roofed hen-house and a pile of straw beneath gave Davy another inspiration. They spent a splendid half-hour climbing on the roof and diving off into the straw with whoops and yells. But even unlawful pleasures must come to an end. When the rumble of wheels over the pond bridge told that people were going home from church, Davy knew they must go. He discarded Tommy's overalls, resumed his own rightful attire, and turned away from his string of trout with a sigh. No use to think of taking them home. "Well, hadn't we a splendid time?" he demanded defiantly as they went down the hill field. "I hadn't," said Dora flatly, "and I don't believe you had really, either," she added with a flash of insight that was not to be expected of her. "I had so," cried Davy, but in the voice of one who doth protest too much. "No wonder you hadn't, just sitting there like a mule." "I ain't going to associate with the Cottons," said Dora loftily. "The Cottons are all right," retorted Davy, "and they have far better times than we have. They do just as they please and say just what they like before everybody. I'm going to do that too after this." "There are lots of things you wouldn't dare say before everybody," averred Dora. "No, there isn't." "There is too." "Would you," demanded Dora gravely, "would you say tomcat before the minister?" This was a staggerer. Davy was not prepared for such a concrete example of the freedom of speech. But one did not have to be consistent with Dora. "Of course not," he admitted sulkily. "Tomcat isn't a holy word. I wouldn't mention such an animal before a minister at all." "But if you had to?" persisted Dora. "I'd call it a Thomas Pussy," said Davy. "I think gentleman cat would be more polite," reflected Dora. "You thinking!" retorted Davy with withering scorn. Davy was not feeling comfortable, though he would have died before he admitted it to Dora. Now that the exhilaration of truant delights had died away, his conscience was beginning to give him salutary twinges. After all, perhaps it would have been better to have gone to Sunday school and church. Mrs. Lynde might be bossy, but there was always a box of cookies in her kitchen cupboard, and she was not stingy. At this inconvenient moment Davy remembered that when he had torn his new school pants the week before, Mrs. Lynde had mended them beautifully, and never said a word to Marilla about them. But Davy's cup of iniquity was not yet full. He was to discover that one sin demands another to cover it. They had dinner with Mrs. Lynde that day, and the first thing she asked Davy was, "Were all your class in Sunday school today?" "Yes'm," said Davy with a gulp. "All were there, 'cept one." "Did you say your golden text and catechism?" "Yes'm." "Did you put your collection in?" "Yes'm." "Was Mrs. Malcolm MacPherson in church?" "I don't know." This at least was the truth, thought wretched Davy. "Was the Ladies' Aid announced for next week?" "Yes'm," quakingly. "Was prayer meeting?" I don't know." "You should know. You should listen more attentively to the announcements. What was Mr. Harvey's text?" Davy took a frantic gulp of water and swallowed it and the last protest of conscience together. He glibly recited an old golden text learned several weeks ago. Fortunately, Mrs. Lynde now stopped questioning him, but Davy did not enjoy his dinner. He could only eat one helping of pudding. "What's the matter with you?" demanded justly astonished Mrs. Lynde. "Are you sick?" "No," muttered Davy. "You look pale. You'd better keep out of the sun this afternoon," admonished Mrs. Lynde. "Do you know how many lies you told Mrs. Lynde?" asked Dora reproachfully as soon as they were alone after dinner. Davy, goaded to desperation, turned fiercely. "I don't know and I don't care," he said. "You just shut up, Dora Keith." Then poor Davy betook himself to a secluded retreat behind the woodpile to think over the way of transgressors. Green Gables was wrapped in darkness and silence when Anne reached home. She lost no time going to bed, for she was very tired and sleepy. There had been several Avonlea jollifications the preceding week involving rather late hours. Anne's head was hardly on her pillow before she was half asleep, but just then her door was softly opened and a pleading voice said, "Anne." Anne sat up drowsily. "Davy, is that you? What is the matter?" A white-clad figure flung itself across the floor and onto the bed. "Anne," sobbed Davy, getting his arms about her neck, "I'm awful glad you're home. I couldn't go to sleep till I'd told somebody." "Told somebody what?" "How miserable I am." "Why are you miserable, dear?" "'Cause I was so bad today, Anne. Oh, I was awful bad. Badder'n I've ever been yet." "What did you do?" "Oh, I'm afraid to tell you. You'll never like me again, Anne. I couldn't say my prayers tonight. I couldn't tell God what I'd done. I was shamed to have him know." "But he knew anyway, Davy." "That's what Dora said. I thought p'raps he mightn't have noticed just at the time. Anyway, I'd rather tell you first." "What is it you did?" Out it all came in a rush. "I run away from Sunday school and went fishing with the Cottons, and I told ever so many whoppers to Mrs. Lynde, oh, most half a dozen, and I said a swear word, Anne. Well, pretty near swear word, anyhow. And I called God names." There was silence. Davy didn't know what to make of it. Was Anne so shocked that she would never speak to him again? "Anne, what are you going to do to me?" he whispered. "Nothing, dear. You've been punished already, I think." "No, I haven't. Nothing's been done to me." "You've been very unhappy ever since you did wrong, haven't you?" "You bet," said Davy emphatically. "That was your conscience punishing you, Davy." "What's my conscience? I want to know." "It's something in you, Davy, that always tells you when you are doing wrong and makes you unhappy if you persist in doing it. Haven't you noticed that?" "Yes, but I didn't know what it was. I wish I didn't have it. I'd have lots more fun. Where is my conscience, Anne? I want to know. Is it in my stomach?" "No, it's in your soul," answered Anne, thankful for the darkness, since gravity must be preserved in serious matters. "I suppose I can't get clear of it, then," said Davy with a sigh. "Are you going to tell Marilla and Mrs. Lynde on me, Anne?" "No, dear, I'm not going to tell anyone. You are sorry you were naughty, weren't you?" "You bet." "And you'll never be bad like that again?" "No, but," added Davy cautiously, "I might be bad some other way." "You won't say naughty words, or run away on Sundays, or tell falsehoods to cover up your sins?" "Nope, it doesn't pay," said Davy. "Well, Davy, just tell God you are sorry and ask him to forgive you." "Have you forgiven me, Anne?" "Yes, dear." "Then," said Davy joyously, "I don't care much whether God does or not. Davy!" "Oh, I'll ask him," said Davy quickly, scrambling off the bed, convinced by Anne's tone that he must have said something dreadful. "I don't mind asking him, Anne. Please God, I'm awfully sorry I behaved bad today, and I'll try to be good on Sundays always, and please forgive me. There now, Anne. Well now, run off to bed like a good boy." "All right. Say, I don't feel miserable any more. I feel fine. Good night." "Good night." Anne slipped down on her pillows with a sigh of relief. Oh, how sleepy she was. In another second— "Anne!" Davy was back again by her bed. Anne dragged her eyes open. "What is it now, dear?" she asked, trying to keep a note of impatience out of her voice. "Anne, have you ever noticed how Mr. Harrison spits? Do you suppose if I practice hard I can learn to spit just like him?" Anne sat up. "Davy Keith," she said, "go straight to your bed and don't let me catch you out of it again tonight. Go, now." Davy went, and stood not upon the order of his going. Chapter 13. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 14. The Summons. Anne was sitting with Ruby Gillis in the Gillis's garden after the day had crept lingeringly through it and was gone. It had been a warm, smoky summer afternoon. The world was in a splendor of outflowering. The idle valleys were full of hazes. The woodways were pranked with shadows, and the fields with the purple of the asters. Anne had given up a moonlight drive to the White Sands beach that she might spend the evening with Ruby. She had so spent many evenings that summer, although she often wondered what good it did anyone, and sometimes went home deciding that she could not go again. Ruby grew paler as the summer waned. The White Sands school was given up. Her father thought it better that she shouldn't teach till New Year's, and the fancy work she loved oftener and oftener fell from hands grown too weary for it. But she was always gay, always hopeful, always chattering and whispering of her beaux and their rivalries and despairs. It was this that made Anne's visits hard for her. What had once been silly or amusing was gruesome now. It was death peering through a wilful mask of life. Yet Ruby seemed to cling to her, and never let her go until she had promised to come again soon. Mrs. Lynde grumbled about Anne's frequent visits, and declared she would catch consumption. Even Marilla was dubious. "Every time you go to see Ruby you come home looking tired out," she said. "It's so very sad and dreadful," said Anne in a low tone. "Ruby doesn't seem to realize her condition in the least, and yet I somehow feel she needs help, craves it, and I want to give it to her and can't. All the time I'm with her I feel as if I were watching her struggle with an invisible foe, trying to push it back with such feeble resistance as she has. That is why I come home tired." But tonight Anne did not feel this so keenly. Ruby was strangely quiet. She said not a word about parties and drives and dresses and fellows. She lay in the hammock with her untouched work beside her, and a white shawl wrapped about her thin shoulders. Her long yellow braids of hair— how Anne had envied those beautiful braids in old schooldays— lay on either side of her. She had taken the pins out. They made her head ache, she said. The hectic flush was gone for the time, leaving her pale and childlike. The moon rose in the silvery sky, empearling the clouds around her. Below, the pond shimmered in its hazy radiance. Just beyond the Gillis homestead was the church, with the old graveyard beside it. The moonlight shone on the white stones, bringing them out in clear-cut relief against the dark trees behind. "How strange the graveyard looks by moonlight," said Ruby suddenly. "How ghostly!" She shuddered. "Anne, it won't be long now before I'll be lying over there. You and Diana and all the rest will be going about, full of life, and I'll be there, in the old graveyard, dead." The surprise of it bewildered Anne. For a few moments she could not speak. "You know it's so, don't you?" said Ruby insistently. "Yes, I know," answered Anne in a low tone. "Dear Ruby, I know." "Everybody knows it," said Ruby bitterly. "I know it. I've known it all summer, though I wouldn't give in. And oh, Anne," she reached out and caught Anne's hand pleadingly, impulsively, "I don't want to die. I'm afraid to die." "Why should you be afraid, Ruby?" asked Anne quietly. Because, oh, I'm not afraid but that I'll go to heaven, Anne. I'm a church member. But it'll all be so different. I think, and I get so frightened and homesick. Heaven must be very beautiful, of course. The Bible says so, but, Anne, it won't be what I've been used to." Through Anne's mind drifted an intrusive recollection of a funny story she had heard Philippa Gordon tell, the story of some old man who had said very much the same thing about the world to come. It had sounded funny then. She remembered how she and Priscilla had laughed over it, but it did not seem in the least humorous now, coming from Ruby's pale, trembling lips. It was sad, tragic, and true. Heaven could not be what Ruby had been used to. There had been nothing in her gay, frivolous life, her shallow ideals and aspirations, to fit her for that great change, or make the life to come seem to her anything but alien and unreal and undesirable. Anne wondered helplessly what she could say that would help her. Could she say anything? "I think, Ruby," she began hesitatingly, for it was difficult for Anne to speak to anyone of the deepest thoughts of her heart, or the new ideas that had vaguely begun to shape themselves in her mind, concerning the great mysteries of life here and hereafter, superseding her old childish conceptions, and it was hardest of all to speak of them to such as Ruby Gillis. "I think perhaps we have very mistaken ideas about heaven, what it is and what it holds for us. I don't think it can be so very different from life here as most people seem to think. I believe we'll just go on living, a good deal as we live here, and be ourselves just the same, only it will be easier to be good and to follow the highest. All the hindrances and perplexities will be taken away, and we shall see clearly. Don't be afraid, Ruby." "I can't help it," said Ruby pitifully. "Even if what you say about heaven is true, and you can't be sure, it may be only that imagination of yours. It won't be just the same. It can't be. I want to go on living here. I'm so young, Anne. I haven't had my life. I've fought so hard to live, and it isn't any use. I have to die, and leave everything I care for." Anne sat in a pain that was almost intolerable. She could not tell comforting falsehoods, and all that Ruby said was so horribly true. She was leaving everything she cared for. She had laid up her treasures on earth only. She had lived solely for the little things of life, the things that pass, forgetting the great things that go onward into eternity, bridging the gulf between the two lives, and making of death a mere passing from one dwelling to the other, from twilight to unclouded day. God would take care of her there, Anne believed. She would learn, but now it was no wonder her soul clung in blind helplessness to the only things she knew and loved. Ruby raised herself on her arm and lifted her bright, beautiful blue eyes to the moonlit skies. "I want to live," she said in a trembling voice. "I want to live like other girls. I want to be married, Anne, and have little children. You know I always loved babies, Anne. I couldn't say this to anyone but you. I know you understand. And then poor Herb. He loves me, and I love him, Anne. The others meant nothing to me, but he does. And if I could live, I would be his wife and be so happy. Oh, Anne, it's hard." Ruby sank back on her pillows and sobbed convulsively. Anne pressed her hand in an agony of sympathy, silent sympathy, which perhaps helped Ruby more than broken, imperfect words could have done, for presently she grew calmer and her sobs ceased. "I'm glad I've told you this, Anne," she whispered. "It has helped me just to say it all out. I've wanted to all summer, every time you came. I wanted to talk it over with you, but I couldn't. It seemed as if it would make death so sure if I said I was going to die, or if anyone else said it or hinted it. I couldn't say it or even think it. In the daytime, when people were around me and everything was cheerful, it wasn't so hard to keep from thinking of it. But in the night, when I couldn't sleep, it was so dreadful, Anne. I couldn't get away from it then. Death just came and stared me in the face until I got so frightened I could have screamed. But you won't be frightened any more, Ruby, will you? You'll be brave, and believe that all is going to be well with you. I'll try. I'll think over what you have said and try to believe it. And you'll come up as often as you can, won't you, Anne? Yes, dear. It won't be very long now, Anne, I feel sure of that. And I'd rather have you than anyone else. I always liked you best of all the girls I went to school with. You were never jealous or mean like some of them were. Poor Em White was up to see me yesterday. You remember Em and I were such chums for 3 years when we went to school, and then we quarreled the time of the school concert. We've never spoken to each other since. Wasn't it silly? Anything like that seems silly now. But Em and I made up the old quarrel yesterday. She said she'd have spoken years ago, only she thought I wouldn't. And I never spoke to her because I was sure she wouldn't speak to me. Isn't it strange how people misunderstand each other, Anne? Most of the trouble in life comes from misunderstanding, I think, said Anne. I must go now, Ruby. It's getting late, and you shouldn't be out in the damp. You'll come up soon again? Yes, very soon. And if there's anything I can do to help you, I'll be so glad. I know. You have helped me already. Nothing seems quite so dreadful now. Good night, Anne. Good night, dear." Anne walked home very slowly in the moonlight. The evening had changed something for her. Life held a different meaning, a deeper purpose. On the surface it would go on just the same, but the deeps had been stirred. It must not be with her as with poor Butterfly Ruby. When she came to the end of one life, it must not be to face the next with the shrinking terror of something wholly different, something for which accustomed thought and ideal and aspiration had unfitted her. The little things of life, sweet and excellent in their place, must not be the things lived for. The highest must be sought and followed. The life of heaven must be begun here on earth. That good night in the garden was for all time. Anne never saw Ruby in life again. The next night the Avis gave a farewell party to Jane Andrews before her departure for the West, and while light feet danced and bright eyes laughed and merry tongues chattered, there came a summons to a soul in Avonlea that might not be disregarded or evaded. The next morning the word went from house to house that Ruby Gillis was dead. She had died in her sleep, painlessly and calmly, and on her face was a smile, as if, after all, death had come as a kindly friend to lead her over the threshold, instead of the grisly phantom she had dreaded. Mrs. Rachel Lynde said emphatically after the funeral that Ruby Gillis was the handsomest corpse she ever laid eyes on. Her loveliness, as she lay white-clad among the delicate flowers that Anne had placed about her, was remembered and talked of for years in Avonlea. Ruby had always been beautiful, but her beauty had been of the earth, earthy. It had had a certain insolent quality in it, as if it flaunted itself in the beholder's eye. Spirit had never shone through it, intellect had never refined it. But death had touched it and consecrated it, bringing out delicate modellings and purity of outline never seen before, doing what life and love and great sorrow and deep womanhood joys might have done for Ruby. Anne, looking down through a mist of tears at her old playfellow, thought she saw the face God had meant Ruby to have, and remembered it so always. Mrs. Gillis called Anne aside into a vacant room before the funeral procession left the house, and gave her a small packet. "I want you to have this," she sobbed. "Ruby would have liked you to have it. It's the embroidered centerpiece she was working at. It isn't quite finished. The needle is sticking in it just where her poor little fingers put it the last time she laid it down, the afternoon before she died." "There's always a piece of unfinished work left," said Mrs. Lynde with tears in her eyes. "But I suppose there's always someone to finish it." "How difficult it is to realize that one we have always known can really be dead," said Anne as she and Diana walked home. "Ruby is the first of our schoolmates to go. One by one, sooner or later, all the rest of us must follow." "Yes, I suppose so," said Diana uncomfortably. She did not want to talk of that. She would have preferred to have discussed the details of the funeral. The splendid white velvet casket Mr. Gillis had insisted on having for Ruby. "The Gillises must always make a splurge, even at funerals," quoth Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Herb Spencer's sad face, the uncontrolled hysteric grief of one of Ruby's sisters. But Anne would not talk of these things. She seemed wrapped in a reverie in which Diana felt lonesomely that she had neither lot nor part. "Ruby Gillis was a great girl to laugh," said Davy suddenly. "Will she laugh as much in heaven as she did in Avonlea, Anne? I want to know." "Yes, I think she will," said Anne. "Oh, Anne!" protested Diana with a rather shocked smile. "Well, why not, Diana?" asked Anne seriously. "Do you think we'll never laugh in heaven?" "Oh, I don't know," floundered Diana. "It doesn't seem just right somehow. You know, it's rather dreadful to laugh in church." "But heaven won't be like church all the time," said Anne. "I hope it ain't," said Davy emphatically. "If it is, I don't want to go. Church is awful dull. Anyway, I don't mean to go for ever so long. I mean to live to be 100 years old, like Mr. Thomas Blewett of White Sands. He says he's lived so long 'cause he always smoked tobacco and it killed all the germs. Can I smoke tobacco pretty soon, Anne?" "No, Davy, I hope you'll never use tobacco," said Anne absently. "What do you feel like if the germs kill me then?" demanded Davy. End of Chapter 14. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 15. A Dream Turned Upside Down. "Just one more week and we go back to Redmond," said Anne. She was happy at the thought of returning to work, classes, and Redmond friends. Pleasing visions were also being woven around Patty's Place. There was a warm, pleasant sense of home in the thought of it, even though she had never lived there. But the summer had been a very happy one, too. A time of glad living with summer suns and skies, a time of keen delight in wholesome things, a time of renewing and deepening of old friendships, a time in which she had learned to live more nobly, to work more patiently, to play more heartily. All life lessons are not learned at college, she thought. Life teaches them everywhere. But alas, the final week of that pleasant vacation was spoiled for Anne by one of those impish happenings which are like a dream turned upside down. "Been writing any more stories lately?" inquired Mr. Harrison genially one evening when Anne was taking tea with him and Mrs. Harrison. "No," answered Anne rather crisply. "Well, no offense meant. Mrs. Hiram Sloane told me the other day that a big envelope addressed to the Rawlings Reliable Baking Powder Company of Montreal had been dropped into the post-office box a month ago, and she suspicioned that somebody was trying for the prize they'd offered for the best story that introduced the name of their baking powder. She said it wasn't addressed in your writing, but I thought maybe it was you." "Indeed, no. I saw the prize offer, but I'd never dream of competing for it. I think it would be perfectly disgraceful to write a story to advertise a baking powder. It would be almost as bad as Judson Parker's patent medicine fence." So spake Anne loftily, little dreaming of the valley of humiliation awaiting her. That very day Diana popped into the porch gable, bright-eyed and rosy-cheeked, carrying a letter. "Oh, Anne, here's a letter for you. I was at the office, so I thought I'd bring it along. Do open it quick. If it is what I believe it is, I shall be just wild with delight." Anne, puzzled, opened the letter and glanced over the typewritten contents. Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables, Avonlea, P.E. Island. Dear Madam, we have much pleasure in informing you that your charming story, Averil's Atonement, has won the prize of $25 offered in our recent competition. We enclose the check herewith. We are arranging for the publication of the story in several prominent Canadian newspapers, and we also intend to have it printed in pamphlet form for distribution among our patrons. Thanking you for the interest you have shown in our enterprise, we remain, yours very truly, the Rawlings Reliable Baking Powder Company. "I don't understand," said Anne blankly. Diana clapped her hands. "Oh, I knew it would win the prize. I was sure of it. I sent your story into the competition, Anne." "Diana Barry!" "Yes, I did," said Diana gleefully, perching herself on the bed. "When I saw the offer I thought of your story in a minute, and at first I thought I'd ask you to send it in, but then I was afraid you wouldn't. You had so little faith left in it. So I just decided I'd send the copy you gave me and say nothing about it. Then if it didn't win the prize you'd never know and you wouldn't feel badly over it because the stories that failed were not to be returned, and if it did you'd have such a delightful surprise." Diana was not the most discerning of mortals, but just at this moment it struck her that Anne was not looking exactly overjoyed. The surprise was there, beyond doubt, but where was the delight? "Why, Anne, you don't seem a bit pleased," she exclaimed. Anne instantly manufactured a smile and put it on. "Of course, I couldn't be anything but pleased over your unselfish wish to give me pleasure," she said slowly. "But you know, I'm so amazed, I can't realize it, and I don't understand. There wasn't a word in my story about... Anne choked a little over the word. "Baking powder." "Oh, I put that in," said Diana, reassured. "It was as easy as wink, and of course my experience in our old story club helped me. You know the scene where Averil makes the cake? Well, I just stated that she used Rawlings Reliable in it, and that was why it turned out so well. And then in the last paragraph, where Percival clasps Averil in his arms and says, 'Sweetheart, the beautiful coming years will bring us the fulfillment of our home of dreams,' I added, 'in which we will never use any baking powder except Rawlings Reliable.'" "Oh," gasped poor Anne, as if someone had dashed cold water on her. "And you've won the $25, continued Diana jubilantly. "Why, I heard Priscilla say once that the Canadian woman only pays $5 for a story." Anne held out the hateful pink slip in shaking fingers. "I can't take it. It's yours by right, Diana. You sent the story in and made the alterations. I would certainly never have sent it, so you must take the check." "I'd like to see myself," said Diana scornfully. "Why, what I did wasn't any trouble. The honor of being a friend of the prize winner is enough for me. Well, I must go. I should have gone straight home from the post office, for we have company, but I simply had to come and hear the news. I'm so glad for your sake, Anne." Anne suddenly bent forward, put her arms about Diana, and kissed her cheek. "I think you are the sweetest and truest friend in the world, Diana," she said, with a little tremble in her voice, "and I assure you I appreciate the motive of what you've done." Diana, pleased and embarrassed, got herself away, and poor Anne, after flinging the innocent check into her bureau drawer as if it were blood money, cast herself on her bed and wept tears of shame and outraged sensibility. Oh, she could never live this down, never! Gilbert arrived at dusk, brimming over with congratulations, for he had called at Orchard Slope and heard the news. But his congratulations died on his lips at the sight of Anne's face. "Why, Anne, what is the matter? I expected to find you radiant over winning Rawlings Reliable prize. Good for you!" "Oh, Gilbert, not you," implored Anne in an et tu, Brute tone. "I thought you would understand. Can't you see how awful it is?"
"I must confess I can't. What is wrong?"
"Everything," moaned Anne. "I feel as if I were disgraced forever. What do you think a mother would feel like if she found her child tattooed over with a baking powder advertisement? I feel just the same. I loved my poor little story, and I wrote it out of the best that was in me. And it is sacrilege to have it degraded to the level of a baking powder advertisement. Don't you remember what Professor Hamilton used to tell us in the literature class at Queen's? He said we were never to write a word for a low or unworthy motive, but always to cling to the very highest ideals. What will he think when he hears I've written a story to advertise Rawlings Reliable? And oh, when it gets out at Redmond, think how I'll be teased and laughed at." "That you won't," said Gilbert, wondering uneasily if it were that confounded junior's opinion in particular over which Anne was worried. "The Reds will think just as I thought, that you, being like 9 out of 10 of us, not overburdened with worldly wealth, had taken this way of earning an honest penny to help yourself through the year. I don't see that there's anything low or unworthy about that, or anything ridiculous either. One would rather write masterpieces of literature, no doubt, but meanwhile board and tuition fees have to be paid." This common-sense, matter-of-fact view of the case cheered Anne a little. At least it removed her dread of being laughed at, though the deeper hurt of an outraged ideal remained. End of chapter 15. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 16. Adjusted Relationships. "It's the homiest spot I ever saw. It's homier than home," avowed Philippa Gordon, looking about her with delighted eyes. They were all assembled at twilight in the big living-room at Patty's Place. Anne and Priscilla, Phil and Stella, Aunt Jamesina, Rusty, Joseph, the Sarah cat, and Gog and Magog. The firelight shadows were dancing over the walls, the cats were purring, and a huge bowl of hothouse chrysanthemums, sent to Phil by one of the victims, shone through the golden gloom like creamy moons. It was 3 weeks since they had considered themselves settled, and already all believed the experiment would be a success. The first fortnight after their return had been a pleasantly exciting one. They had been busy setting up their household goods, organizing their little establishment, and adjusting different opinions. Anne was not over sorry to leave Avonlea when the time came to return to college. The last few days of her vacation had not been pleasant. Her prize story had been published in the Island papers, and Mr. William Blair had, upon the counter of his store, a huge pile of pink, green, and yellow pamphlets containing it, one of which he gave to every customer. He sent a complimentary bundle to Anne, who promptly dropped them all in the kitchen stove. Her humiliation was the consequence of her own ideals only, for Avonlea folks thought it quite splendid that she should have won the prize. Her many friends regarded her with honest admiration, her few foes with scornful envy. Josie Pye said she believed Anne Shirley had just copied the story. She was sure she remembered reading it in a paper years before. The Sloanes, who had found out or guessed that Charlie had been turned down, said they didn't think it was much to be proud of. Almost anyone could have done it if she tried. Aunt Atossa told Anne she was very sorry to hear she had taken to writing novels. Nobody born and bred in Avonlea would do it. That was what came of adopting orphans from goodness knew where, with goodness knew what kind of parents. Even Mrs. Rachel Lynde was darkly dubious about the propriety of writing fiction, though she was almost reconciled to it by that $25 check. "It is perfectly amazing, the price they pay for such lies, that's what," she said half proudly, half severely. All things considered, it was a relief when going-away time came, and it was very jolly to be back at Redmond, a wise, experienced soph, with hosts of friends to greet on the merry opening day. Pris and Stella and Gilbert were there, Charlie Sloane looking more important than ever a sophomore looked before, Phil with the Alec and Alonzo question still unsettled, and Moody Spurgeon Macpherson. Moody Spurgeon had been teaching school ever since leaving Queen's, but his mother had concluded it was high time he gave it up and turned his attention to learning how to be a minister. Poor Moody Spurgeon fell on hard luck at the very beginning of his college career. Half a dozen ruthless sophs, who were among his fellow boarders, swooped down on him one night and shaved half of his head. In this guise the luckless Moody Spurgeon had to go about until his hair grew again. He told Anne bitterly that there were times when he had his doubts as to whether he was really called to be a minister. Aunt Jamesina did not come until the girls had Patty's Place ready for her. Miss Patty had sent the key to Anne, with a letter in which she said Gog and Magog were packed in a box under the spare-room bed, but might be taken out when wanted. In a postscript she added that she hoped the girls would be careful about putting up pictures. The living-room had been newly papered 5 years before, and she and Miss Maria did not want any more holes made in that new paper than was absolutely necessary. For the rest, she trusted everything to Anne. How those girls enjoyed putting their nest in order! As Phil said, it was almost as good as getting married. You had the fun of home-making without the bother of a husband. All brought something with them to adorn or make comfortable the little house. Pris and Phil and Stella had knick-knacks and pictures galore, which latter they proceeded to hang according to taste in reckless disregard of Miss Patty's new paper. "We'll putty the holes up when we leave, dear. She'll never know," they said to protesting Anne. Diana had given Anne a pine needle cushion, and Miss Ada had given both her and Priscilla a fearfully and wonderfully embroidered one. Marilla had sent a big box of preserves, and darkly hinted at a hamper for Thanksgiving, and Mrs. Lynde gave Anne a patchwork quilt and loaned her 5 more. "You take them," she said authoritatively. "They might as well be in use as packed away in that trunk in the garret for moths to gnaw." No moths would ever have ventured near those quilts, for they reeked of mothballs to such an extent that they had to be hung in the orchard of Patty's Place a full fortnight before they could be endured indoors. Verily, aristocratic Spofford Avenue had rarely beheld such a display. The gruff old millionaire who lived next door came over and wanted to buy the gorgeous red and yellow tulip pattern one which Mrs. Rachel had given Anne. He said his mother used to make quilts like that, and by Jove he wanted one to remind him of her. Anne would not sell it, much to his disappointment, but she wrote all about it to Mrs. Lynde. That highly gratified lady sent word back that she had one just like it to spare, so the Tobacco King got his quilt after all, and insisted on having it spread on his bed, to the disgust of his fashionable wife. Mrs. Lynde's quilt served a very useful purpose that winter. Patty's Place, for all its many virtues, had its faults also. It was really a rather cold house, and when the frosty nights came, the girls were very glad to snuggle down under Mrs. Lynde's quilts, and hoped that the loan of them might be accounted unto her for righteousness. Anne had the blue room she had coveted at sight. Priscilla and Stella had the large one. Phil was blissfully content with the little one over the kitchen, and Aunt Jamesina was to have the downstairs one off the living-room. Rusty at first slept on the doorstep. Anne, walking home from Redmond a few days after her return, became aware that people she met surveyed her with a covert, indulgent smile. Anne wondered uneasily what was the matter with her. Was her hat crooked? Was her belt loose? Craning her head to investigate, Anne, for the first time, saw Rusty. Trotting along beside her, close to her heels, was quite the most forlorn specimen of the cat tribe she had ever beheld. The animal was well past kittenhood, lank, thin, disreputable-looking. Pieces of both ears were lacking, one eye was temporarily out of repair, and one jowl ludicrously swollen. As for color, if a once black cat had been well and thoroughly singed, the result would have resembled the hue of this waif's thin, draggled, unsightly fur. Anne shooed, but the cat would not shoo. As long as she stood, he sat back on his haunches and gazed at her reproachfully out of his one good eye. When she resumed her walk, he followed. Anne resigned herself to his company until she reached the gate of Patty's Place, which she coldly shut in his face, fondly supposing she had seen the last of him. But when 15 minutes later Phil opened the door, there sat the rusty brown cat on the step. More, he promptly darted in and sprang upon Anne's lap with a half-pleading, half-triumphant meow. "Anne," said Stella severely, "do you own that animal?" "No, I do not," protested disgusted Anne. "The creature followed me home from somewhere. I couldn't get rid of him. Ugh, get down. I like decent cats reasonably well, but I don't like beasties of your complexion." Pussy, however, refused to get down. He coolly curled up in Anne's lap and began to purr. "He has evidently adopted you," laughed Priscilla. "I won't be adopted," said Anne stubbornly. "Poor creature is starving," said Phil pityingly. "Why, his bones are almost coming through his skin." "Well, I'll give him a square meal, and then he must return to whence he came," said Anne resolutely. The cat was fed and put out. In the morning he was still on the doorstep. On the doorstep he continued to sit, bolting in whenever the door was opened. No coolness of welcome had the least effect on him. Of nobody save Anne did he take the least notice. Out of compassion the girls fed him, but when a week had passed, they decided that something must be done. The cat's appearance had improved. His eye and cheek had resumed their normal appearance. He was not quite so thin, and he had been seen washing his face. "But for all that, we can't keep him," said Stella. "Aunt Jimsie is coming next week, and she will bring the Sarah cat with her. We can't keep 2 cats, and if we did, this rusty coat would fight all the time with the Sarah cat. He's a fighter by nature.
He had a pitched battle last evening with the Tobacco King's cat and routed him, horse, foot, and artillery." "We must get rid of him," agreed Anne, looking darkly at the subject of their discussion, who was purring on the hearth-rug with an air of lamb-like meekness. "But the question is, how? How can 4 unprotected females get rid of a cat who won't be got rid of?" "We must chloroform him," said Phil briskly. "That is the most humane way." "Who of us knows anything about chloroforming a cat?" demanded Anne gloomily. "I do, honey. It's one of my few, sadly few, useful accomplishments. I've disposed of several at home. You take the cat in the morning and give him a good breakfast. Then you take an old burlap bag, there's one on the back porch, put the cat in it and turn him over a wooden box. Then take a 2-ounce bottle of chloroform, uncork it and slip it under the edge of the box. Put a heavy weight on top of the box and leave it till evening. The cat will be dead, curled up peacefully as if he were asleep. No pain, no struggle." "It sounds easy," said Anne dubiously. "It is easy. Just leave it to me. I'll see to it," said Phil reassuringly. Accordingly the chloroform was procured, and the next morning Rusty was lured to his doom. He ate his breakfast, licked his chops, and climbed into Anne's lap. Anne's heart misgave her. This poor creature loved her, trusted her. How could she be a party to this destruction? "Here, take him," she said hastily to Phil. "I feel like a murderess." "He won't suffer, you know," comforted Phil, but Anne had fled. The fatal deed was done in the back porch. Nobody went near it that day, but at dusk Phil declared that Rusty must be buried. "Pris and Stella must dig his grave in the orchard," declared Phil, "and Anne must come with me to lift the box off. That's the part I always hate." The 2 conspirators tiptoed reluctantly to the back porch. Phil gingerly lifted the stone she had put on the box. Suddenly, faint but distinct, sounded an unmistakable meow under the box. He isn't dead," gasped Anne, sitting blankly down on the kitchen doorstep. "He must be," said Phil incredulously. Another tiny meow proved that he wasn't. The 2 girls stared at each other. "What will we do?" questioned Anne. "Why in the world don't you come?" demanded Stella, appearing in the doorway. "We've got the grave ready. 'What silent still and silent all,'" she quoted teasingly. "Oh, no, the voices of the dead sound like the distant torrent's fall," promptly counter-quoted Anne, pointing solemnly to the box. A burst of laughter broke the tension. "We must leave him here till morning," said Phil, replacing the stone. "He hasn't meowed for 5 minutes. Perhaps the meows we heard were his dying groan. Or perhaps we merely imagined them under the strain of our guilty consciences." But when the box was lifted in the morning, Rusty bounded at one gay leap to Anne's shoulder, where he began to lick her face affectionately. Never was there a cat more decidedly alive. "There's a knot-hole in the box," groaned Phil. "I never saw it. That's why he didn't die. Now we've got to do it all over again." "No, we haven't," declared Anne suddenly. "Rusty isn't going to be killed again. He's my cat, and you've just got to make the best of it." "Oh, well, if you'll settle with Aunt Jimsie and the Sarah-cat," said Stella, with the air of one washing her hands of the whole affair. From that time Rusty was one of the family. He slept o' nights on the scrubbing cushion in the back porch, and lived on the fat of the land. By the time Aunt Jamesina came he was plump and glossy and tolerably respectable. But, like Kipling's cat, he walked by himself. His paw was against every cat, and every cat's paw against him. One by one he vanquished the aristocratic felines of Spofford Avenue. As for human beings, he loved Anne and Anne alone. Nobody else even dared stroke him. An angry spit and something that sounded much like very improper language greeted anyone who did. "The airs that cat puts on are perfectly intolerable," declared Stella. "Him was a nice old pussums, him was," vowed Anne, cuddling her pet defiantly. "Well, I don't know how he and the Sarah-cat will ever make out to live together," said Stella pessimistically. "Cat fights in the orchard o' nights are bad enough, but cat fights here in the living-room are unthinkable." In due time Aunt Jamesina arrived. Anne and Priscilla and Phil had awaited her advent rather dubiously, but when Aunt Jamesina was enthroned in the rocking-chair before the open fire, they figuratively bowed down and worshipped her. Aunt Jamesina was a tiny old woman, with a little, softly triangular face, and large, soft blue eyes that were alight with unquenchable youth, and as full of hopes as a girl's. She had pink cheeks and snow-white hair, which she wore in quaint little puffs over her ears. "It's a very old-fashioned way," she said, knitting industriously at something as dainty and pink as a sunset cloud. "But I am old-fashioned. My clothes are, and it stands to reason my opinions are, too. I don't say they're any the better of that, mind you. In fact, I dare say they're a good deal the worse, but they've worn nice and easy. New shoes are smarter than old ones, but the old ones are more comfortable. I'm old enough to indulge myself in the matter of shoes and opinions. I mean to take it real easy here. I know you expect me to look after you and keep you proper, but I'm not going to do it. You're old enough to know how to behave if you're ever going to be. So as far as I'm concerned," concluded Aunt Jamesina with a twinkle in her young eyes, "you can all go to destruction in your own way." "Oh, will somebody separate those cats?" pleaded Stella shudderingly. Aunt Jamesina had brought with her not only the Sarah cat, but Joseph. Joseph, she explained, had belonged to a dear friend of hers who had gone to live in Vancouver. She couldn't take Joseph with her, so she begged me to take him. I really couldn't refuse. He's a beautiful cat. That is, his disposition is beautiful. She called him Joseph because his coat is of many colors. It certainly was. Joseph, as the disgusted Stella said, looked like a walking rag-bag. It was impossible to say what his ground color was. His legs were white with black spots on them. His back was gray with a huge patch of yellow on one side and a black patch on the other. His tail was yellow with a gray tip. One ear was black and one yellow. A black patch over one eye gave him a fearfully rakish look. In reality he was meek and inoffensive, of a social disposition. In one respect, if in no other, Joseph was like a lily of the field. He toiled not, neither did he spin nor catch mice. Yet Solomon in all his glory slept not on softer cushions, or feasted more fully on fat things. Joseph and the Sarah cat arrived by express in separate boxes. After they had been released and fed, Joseph selected the cushion and corner which appealed to him, and the Sarah cat gravely sat herself down before the fire and proceeded to wash her face. She was a large, sleek, grey and white cat, with an enormous dignity which was not at all impaired by any consciousness of her plebeian origin. She had been given to Aunt Jamesina by her washerwoman. "Her name was Sarah, so my husband always called Puss the Sarah cat," explained Aunt Jamesina. "She is 8 years old and a remarkable mouser. Don't worry, Stella. The Sarah cat never fights, and Joseph rarely." "They'll have to fight here in self-defense," said Stella. At this juncture Rusty arrived on the scene. He bounded joyously halfway across the room before he saw the intruders. Then he stopped short. His tail expanded until it was as big as 3 tails. The fur on his back rose up in a defiant arch. Rusty lowered his head, uttered a fearful shriek of hatred and defiance, and launched himself at the Sarah cat. The stately animal had stopped washing her face and was looking at him curiously. She met his onslaught with one contemptuous sweep of her capable paw. Rusty went rolling helplessly over on the rug. He picked himself up dazedly. What sort of a cat was this who had boxed his ears? He looked dubiously at the Sarah cat. Would he, or would he not? The Sarah cat deliberately turned her back on him and resumed her toilet operations. Rusty decided that he would not. He never did. From that time on, the Sarah cat ruled the roost. Rusty never again interfered with her. But Joseph rashly sat up and yawned. Rusty, burning to avenge his disgrace, swooped down on him. Joseph, pacific by nature, could fight upon occasion, and fight well. The result was a series of drawn battles. Every day Rusty and Joseph fought at sight. Anne took Rusty's part and detested Joseph. Stella was in despair, but Aunt Jamesina only laughed. "Let them fight it out," she said tolerantly. "They'll make friends after a bit. Joseph needs some exercise. He was getting too fat. And Rusty has to learn he isn't the only cat in the world." Eventually Joseph and Rusty accepted the situation, and from sworn enemies became sworn friends. They slept on the same cushion with their paws about each other, and gravely watched each other's faces. "We've all got used to each other," said Phil, "and I've learned how to wash dishes and sweep a floor." "But you needn't try to make us believe you can chloroform a cat," laughed Anne. "It was all the fault of the knot-hole," protested Phil. "It was a good thing the knot-hole was there," said Aunt Jamesina rather severely. "Kittens have to be drowned, I admit, or the world would be overrun, but no decent grown-up cat should be done to death unless he sucks eggs." "You wouldn't have thought Rusty very decent if you'd seen him when he came here," said Stella. "He positively looked like the old Nick." "I don't believe old Nick can be so very ugly," said Aunt Jamesina reflectively. "He wouldn't do so much harm if he was. I always think of him as a rather handsome gentleman." End of chapter 16.
Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Chapter 17. A Letter from Davy. "It's beginning to snow, girls," said Phil, coming in one November evening, "and there are the loveliest little stars and crosses all over the garden walk. I never noticed before what exquisite things snowflakes really are. One has time to notice things like that in the simple life. Bless you all for permitting me to live it. It's really delightful to feel worried because butter has gone up 5 cents a pound." "Has it?" demanded Stella, who kept the household accounts. "It has, and here's your butter. I'm getting quite expert at marketing. It's better fun than flirting," concluded Phil gravely. "Everything is going up scandalously," sighed Stella. "Never mind. Thank goodness air and salvation are still free," said Aunt Jamesina. "And so is laughter," added Anne. "There's no tax on it yet, and that is well, because you're all going to laugh presently. I'm going to read you Davy's letter. His spelling has improved immensely this past year, though he's not strong on apostrophes, and he certainly possesses the gift of writing an interesting letter. Listen and laugh before we settle down to the evening's study grind." "Dear Anne," ran Davy's letter, "I take my pen to tell you that we are all pretty well and hope this will find you the same. It's snowing some today, and Marilla says the old woman in the sky is shaking her feather beds. Is the old woman in the sky God's wife, Anne? I want to know. Mrs. Lynde has been real sick, but she is better now. She fell down the cellar stairs last week. When she fell she grabbed hold of the shelf with all the milk pails and stew pans on it, and it gave way and went down with her and made a splendid crash. Marilla thought it was an earthquake at first. One of the stew pans was all dinged up, and Mrs. Lynde strained her ribs. The doctor came and gave her medicine to rub on her ribs, but she didn't understand him and took it all inside instead. The doctor said it was a wonder it didn't kill her, but it didn't, and it cured her ribs, and Mrs. Lynde says doctors don't know much anyhow. But we couldn't fix up the stew pan. Marilla had to throw it out. Thanksgiving was last week. There was no school, and we had a great dinner. I ate mince pie and roast turkey and fruit cake and doughnuts and cheese and jam and chocolate cake. Marilla said I'd die, but I didn't. Dora had earache after it, only it wasn't in her ears, it was in her stomach. I didn't have earache anywhere. Our new teacher is a man. He does things for jokes. Last week he made all us third-class boys write a composition on what kind of a wife we'd like to have, and the girls on what kind of a husband. He laughed fit to kill when he read them. This was mine. I thought you'd like to see it. The kind of a wife I'd like to have. She must have good manners and get my meals on time and do what I tell her and always be very polite to me. She must be 15 years old. She must be good to the poor and keep her house tidy and be good-tempered and go to church regularly. She must be very handsome and have curly hair. If I get a wife that is just what I like, it'll be an awful good husband to her. I think a woman ought to be awful good to her husband. Some poor women haven't any husbands. The end. I was at Mrs. Isaac Wright's funeral at White Sands last week. The husband of the corpse felt real sorry. Mrs. Lynde says Mrs. Wright's grandfather stole a sheep, but Marilla says we mustn't speak ill of the dead. Why mustn't we, Anne? I want to know. It's pretty safe, ain't it? Mrs. Lynde was awful mad the other day because I asked her if she was alive in Noah's time. I didn't mean to hurt her feelings. I just wanted to know. Was she, Anne? Mr. Harrison wanted to get rid of his dog, so he hunged him once, but he come to life and scooted for the barn while Mr. Harrison was digging the grave, so he hunged him again, and he stayed dead that time. Mr. Harrison has a new man working for him. He's awful awkward. Mr. Harrison says he is left-handed in both his feet. Mr. Barry's hired man is lazy. Mrs. Barry says that, but Mr. Barry says he ain't lazy exactly, only he thinks it easier to pray for things than to work for them. Mrs. Harmon Andrews' prize pig that she talked so much of died in a fit. Mrs. Lynde says it was a judgment on her for pride, but I think it was hard on the pig. Milty Boulter has been sick. The doctor gave him medicine and it tasted horrid. I offered to take it for him for a quarter, but the Boulters are so mean. Milty says he'd rather take it himself and save his money. I asked Mrs. Boulter how a person would go about catching a man, and she got awful mad and said she didn't know, she'd never chased men. The Avis is going to paint the hall again. They're tired of having it blue. The new minister was here to tea last night. He took 3 pieces of pie. If I did that, Mrs. Lynde would call me piggy. And he ate fast and took big bites, and Marilla is always telling me not to do that. Why can ministers do what boys can't? I want to know. I haven't any more news. Here are 6 kisses. XXXXXX. Dora sends 1. Here's hers. X. Your loving friend, David Keith. P.S. Anne, who was the devil's father? I want to know. End of chapter 17.
Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Chapter 18. Miss Josephine Remembers the Anne Girl. When Christmas holidays came, the girls of Patty's Place scattered to their respective homes, but Aunt Jamesina elected to stay where she was. I couldn't go to any of the places I've been invited and take those 3 cats, she said, and I'm not going to leave the poor creatures here alone for nearly 3 weeks. If we had any decent neighbors who would feed them, I might, but there's nothing except millionaires on this street, so I'll stay here and keep Patty's Place warm for you. Anne went home with the usual joyous anticipations, which were not wholly fulfilled. She found Avonlea in the grip of such an early, cold, and stormy winter as even the oldest inhabitant could not recall. Green Gables was literally hemmed in by huge drifts. Almost every day of that ill-starred vacation it stormed fiercely, and even on fine days it drifted unceasingly. No sooner were the roads broken than they filled in again. It was almost impossible to stir out. The Avis tried on 3 evenings to have a party in honor of the college students, and on each evening the storm was so wild that nobody could go, so they gave up the attempt in despair. Anne, despite her love of and loyalty to Green Gables, could not help thinking longingly of Patty's Place, its cozy open fire, Aunt Jamesina's mirthful eyes, the 3 cats, the merry chatter of the girls, the pleasantness of Friday evenings when college friends dropped in to talk of grave and gay. Anne was lonely. Diana, during the whole of the holidays, was imprisoned at home with a bad attack of bronchitis. She could not come to Green Gables, and it was rarely Anne could get to Orchard Slope, for the old way through the haunted woods was impassable with drifts, and the long way over the frozen lake of Shining Waters was almost as bad. Ruby Gillis was sleeping in the white-heaped graveyard. Jane Andrews was teaching a school on western prairies. Gilbert, to be sure, was still faithful and waded up to Green Gables every possible evening. But Gilbert's visits were not what they once were. Anne almost dreaded them. It was very disconcerting to look up in the midst of a sudden silence and find Gilbert's hazel eyes fixed upon her, with a quite unmistakable expression in their grave depths. And it was still more disconcerting to find herself blushing hotly and uncomfortably under his gaze, just as if, well, it was very embarrassing. Anne wished herself back at Patty's Place, where there was always somebody else about to take the edge off a delicate situation. At Green Gables, Marilla went promptly to Mrs. Lynde's domain when Gilbert came, and insisted on taking the twins with her. The significance of this was unmistakable, and Anne was in a helpless fury over it. Davy, however, was perfectly happy. He revelled in getting out in the morning and shoveling out the paths to the well and the hen-house. He gloried in the Christmas-tide delicacies which Marilla and Mrs. Lynde vied with each other in preparing for Anne, and he was reading an enthralling tale in a school library book of a wonderful hero who seemed blessed with a miraculous faculty for getting into scrapes from which he was usually delivered by an earthquake or a volcanic explosion, which blew him high and dry out of his troubles, landed him in a fortune, and closed the story with proper éclat. "I tell you it's a bully story, Anne," he said ecstatically. "I'd ever so much read it than the Bible." "Would you?" smiled Anne. Davy peered curiously at her. "You don't seem a bit shocked, Anne. Mrs. Lynde was awful shocked when I said it to her." "No, I'm not shocked, Davy. I think it's quite natural that a 9-year-old boy would sooner read an adventure story than the Bible. But when you are older I hope and think that you will realize what a wonderful book the Bible is." "Oh, some parts of it are fine," conceded Davy. "That story about Joseph now, it's bully. But if I'd been Joseph, I wouldn't have forgive the brothers. No, sirree, Anne. I'd have cut all their heads off. Mrs. Lynde was awful mad when I said that and shut the Bible up and said she'd never read me any more of it if I talked like that. So I don't talk now when she reads it Sunday afternoons. I just think things and say them to Milty Boulter next day in school. I told Milty the story about Elisha and the bears, and it scared him so he's never made fun of Mr. Harrison's bald head once. Are there any bears on P.E. Island, Anne? I want to know." "Not nowadays," said Anne absently, as the wind blew a scud of snow against the window. "Oh, dear, will it ever stop storming?" "God knows," said Davy airily, preparing to resume his reading. Anne was shocked this time. "Davy!" she exclaimed reproachfully. "Mrs. Lynde says that," protested Davy. "One night last week Marilla said, 'Will Ludovic Speed and Theodora Dix ever get married?' and Mrs. Lynde said, 'God knows,' just like that." "Well, it wasn't right for her to say it," said Anne, promptly deciding upon which horn of this dilemma to impale herself. "It isn't right for anybody to take that name in vain or speak it lightly, Davy. Don't ever do it again." "Not if I say it slow and solemn like the minister?" queried Davy gravely. "No, not even then." "Well, I won't. Ludovic Speed and Theodora Dix live in Middle Grafton, and Mrs. Rachel says he's been courting her for 100 years. Won't they soon be too old to get married, Anne? I hope Gilbert won't court you that long. When are you going to be married, Anne? Mrs. Lynde says it's a sure thing." "Mrs. Lynde is a—" began Anne hotly, then stopped. "Awful old gossip," completed Davy calmly. "That's what everyone calls her. But is it a sure thing, Anne? I want to know." "You're a very silly little boy, Davy," said Anne, stalking haughtily out of the room. The kitchen was deserted, and she sat down by the window in the fast-falling wintry twilight. The sun had set and the wind had died down. A pale, chilly moon looked out behind a bank of purple clouds in the west. The sky faded out, but the strip of yellow along the western horizon grew brighter and fiercer, as if all the stray gleams of light were concentrating in one spot. The distant hills, rimmed with priest-like firs, stood out in dark distinctness against it. Anne looked across the still, white fields, cold and lifeless in the harsh light of that grim sunset, and sighed. She was very lonely, and she was sad at heart, for she was wondering if she would be able to return to Redmond next year. It did not seem likely. The only scholarship possible in the sophomore year was a very small affair. She would not take Marilla's money, and there seemed little prospect of being able to earn enough in the summer vacation. "I suppose I'll just have to drop out next year," she thought drearily, "and teach a district school again until I earn enough to finish my course. And by that time all my old class will have graduated, and Patty's Place will be out of the question. But there, I'm not going to be a coward. I'm thankful I can earn my way through if necessary." "Here's Mr. Harrison waiting up the lane," announced Davy, running out. "I hope he's brought the mail. It's 3 days since we got it. I want to see what them pesky Grits are doing. I'm a conservative, Anne, and I tell you, you have to keep your eye on them Grits." Mr. Harrison had brought the mail, and merry letters from Stella and Priscilla and Phil soon dissipated Anne's blues. Aunt Jamesina, too, had written, saying that she was keeping the hearth fire alight, and that the cats were all well, and the house-plants doing fine. "The weather has been real cold," she wrote, "so I let the cats sleep in the house. Rusty and Joseph on the sofa in the living room, and the Sarah cat on the foot of my bed. It's real company to hear her purring when I wake up in the night and think of my poor daughter in the foreign field. If it was anywhere but in India, I wouldn't worry, but they say the snakes out there are terrible. It takes all the Sarah cat's purring to drive away the thought of those snakes. I have enough faith for everything but the snakes. I can't think why Providence ever made them. Sometimes I don't think he did. I'm inclined to believe the old Harry had a hand in making them." Anne had left a thin typewritten communication till the last, thinking it unimportant. When she had read it, she sat very still, with tears in her eyes. "What is the matter, Anne?" asked Marilla. "Miss Josephine Barry is dead," said Anne in a low tone. "So she is gone at last," said Marilla. "Well, she has been sick for over a year, and the Barrys have been expecting to hear of her death any time. It is well she is at rest, for she has suffered dreadfully, Anne. She was always kind to you." "She has been kind to the last, Marilla. This letter is from her lawyer. She has left me $1,000 in her will." "Gracious, ain't that an awful lot of money?" exclaimed Davy. "She's the woman you and Diana lit on when you jumped into the spare room bed, ain't she? Diana told me that story. Is that why she left you so much?" "Hush, Davy," said Anne gently. She slipped away to the porch gable with a full heart, leaving Marilla and Mrs. Lynde to talk over the news to their heart's content. "Do you suppose Anne will ever get married now?" speculated Davy anxiously. "When Dorcas Sloane got married last summer, she said if she'd had enough money to live on, she'd never have been bothered with a man, but even a widower with 8 children was better than living with a sister-in-law." "Davy Keith, do hold your tongue," said Mrs. Rachel severely. "The way you talk is scandalous for a small boy, that's what." End of chapter 18.
Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Chapter 19. An Interlude. "To think that this is my 20th birthday, and that I've left my teens behind me forever," said Anne, who was curled up on the hearthrug with Rusty in her lap, to Aunt Jamesina, who was reading in her pet chair. They were alone in the living room. Stella and Priscilla had gone to a committee meeting, and Phil was upstairs adorning herself for a party. "I suppose you feel kind of sorry," said Aunt Jamesina. "The teens are such a nice part of life. I'm glad I've never gone out of them myself." Anne laughed. "You never will, Auntie. You'll be 18 when you should be 100. "Yes, I am sorry, and a little dissatisfied as well. Miss Stacy told me long ago that by the time I was 20 my character would be formed, for good or evil. I don't feel that it's what it should be. It's full of flaws." "So's everybody's," said Aunt Jamesina cheerfully. "Mine's cracked in 100 places. Your Miss Stacy likely meant that when you're 20 your character would have got its permanent bent in one direction or t'other, and would go on developing in that line. Don't worry over it, Anne. Do your duty by God and your neighbor and yourself, and have a good time. That's my philosophy, and it's always worked pretty well. Where's Phil off to tonight?" "She's going to a dance, and she's got the sweetest dress for it. Creamy yellow silk and cobwebby lace. It just suits those brown tints of hers." "There's magic in the words silk and lace, isn't there?" said Aunt Jamesina. "The very sound of them makes me feel like skipping off to a dance. And yellow silk! It makes one think of a dress of sunshine. I always wanted a yellow silk dress, but first my mother and then my husband wouldn't hear of it. The very first thing I'm going to do when I get to heaven is to get a yellow silk dress." Amid Anne's peal of laughter Phil came downstairs, trailing clouds of glory, and surveyed herself in the long oval mirror on the wall. "A flattering looking-glass is a promoter of amiability," she said. "The one in my room does certainly make me green. Do I look pretty nice, Anne?" "Do you really know how pretty you are, Phil?" asked Anne in honest admiration. "Of course I do. What are looking-glasses and men for? That wasn't what I meant. Are all my ends tucked in? Is my skirt straight? And would this rose look better lower down? I'm afraid it's too high. It will make me look lopsided, but I hate things tickling my ears." "Everything is just right, and that southwest dimple of yours is lovely. And there's one thing in particular I like about you. You're so ungrudging. There isn't a particle of envy in you." "Why should she be envious?" demanded Aunt Jamesina. "She's not quite as good-looking as you, maybe, but she's got a far handsomer nose." "I know it," conceded Phil. "My nose always has been a great comfort to me," confessed Anne. "And I love the way your hair grows on your forehead, Anne, and that one wee curl, always looking as if it were going to drop, but never dropping, is delicious. But as for noses, mine is a dreadful worry to me. I know by the time I'm 40 it will be Bernie. What do you think I'll look like when I'm 40, Anne?" "Like an old, matronly married woman," teased Anne. "I won't," said Phil, sitting down comfortably to wait for her escort. "Joseph, you calico beastie, don't you dare jump on my lap. I won't go to a dance all over cat hairs. No, Anne, I won't look matronly, but no doubt I'll be married." "To Alec or Alonzo?" asked Anne. "To one of them, I suppose," sighed Phil, "if I can ever decide which." "It shouldn't be hard to decide," scolded Aunt Jamesina. "I was born a seesaw, Auntie, and nothing can ever prevent me from teetering." "You ought to be more level-headed, Philippa." "It's best to be level-headed, of course," agreed Philippa, "but you miss lots of fun. As for Alec and Alonzo, if you knew them you'd understand why it's difficult to choose between them. They're equally nice." "Then take somebody who is nicer," suggested Aunt Jamesina. "There's that senior who is so devoted to you, Will Leslie. He has such nice, large, mild eyes." "They're a little bit too large and too mild, like a cow's," said Phil cruelly. "What do you say about George Parker?" "There's nothing to say about him except that he always looks as if he had just been starched and ironed." "Marr Holworthy, then. You can't find a fault with him?" "No, he would do if he wasn't poor. I must marry a rich man, Aunt Jamesina. That and good looks is an indispensable qualification. I'd marry Gilbert Blythe if he were rich." "Oh, would you?" said Anne rather viciously. "We don't like that idea a little bit, although we don't want Gilbert ourselves. Oh, no," mocked Phil. "But don't let's talk of disagreeable subjects. I'll have to marry sometime, I suppose, but I shall put off the evil day as long as I can." "You mustn't marry anybody you don't love, Phil, when all's said and done," said Aunt Jamesina. "Oh, hearts that loved in the good old way have been out of the fashion this many a day," trilled Phil mockingly. "There's the carriage. I fly. Bye-bye, you two old-fashioned darlings." When Phil had gone, Aunt Jamesina looked solemnly at Anne. "That girl is pretty and sweet and good-hearted, but do you think she is quite right in her mind by spells, Anne?" "Oh, I don't think there's anything the matter with Phil's mind," said Anne, hiding a smile. "It's just her way of talking." Aunt Jamesina shook her head. "Well, I hope so, Anne. I do hope so, because I love her. But I can't understand her. She beats me. She isn't like any of the girls I ever knew, or any of the girls I was myself." "How many girls were you, Aunt Jimsie?" "About half a dozen, my dear." End of Chapter 19.
Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery.
Chapter 20. Gilbert Speaks. "This has been a dull, prosy day," yawned Phil, stretching herself idly on the sofa, having previously dispossessed 2 exceedingly indignant cats. Anne looked up from Pickwick Papers. Now that spring examinations were over, she was treating herself to Dickens. "It has been a prosy day for us," she said thoughtfully, "but to some people it has been a wonderful day. Someone has been rapturously happy in it. Perhaps a great deed has been done somewhere today, or a great poem written, or a great man born. And some heart has been broken, Phil. Why did you spoil your pretty thought by tagging that last sentence on, honey?" grumbled Phil. "I don't like to think of broken hearts, or anything unpleasant." "Do you think you'll be able to shirk unpleasant things all your life, Phil?" "Dear me, no. Am I not up against them now? You don't call Alec and Alonzo pleasant things, do you, when they simply plague my life out?" "You never take anything seriously, Phil." "Why should I? There are enough folks who do. The world needs people like me, Anne, just to amuse it. It would be a terrible place if everybody were intellectual and serious and in deep, deadly earnest. My mission is, as Josiah Allen says, to charm and allure. Confess now. Hasn't life at Patty's Place been really much brighter and pleasanter this past winter because I've been here to lovin' you?" "Yes, it has," owned Anne. "And you all love me, even Aunt Jamesina, who thinks I'm stark mad. so why should I try to be different? Oh dear, I'm so sleepy. I was awake until 1 last night, reading a harrowing ghost story. I read it in bed, and after I had finished it, do you suppose I could get out of bed to put the light out? No. And if Stella had not fortunately come in late, that lamp would have burned good and bright till morning. When I heard Stella, I called her in, explained my predicament, and got her to put out the light. If I had got out myself to do it, I knew something would grab me by the feet when I was getting in again. By the way, Anne, has Aunt Jamesina decided what to do this summer? Yes, she's going to stay here. I know she's doing it for the sake of those blessed cats, although she says it's too much trouble to open her own house, and she hates visiting. What are you reading? Pickwick? That's a book that always makes me hungry, said Phil. There's so much good eating in it. The characters seem always to be revelling on ham and eggs and milk punch. I generally go on a cupboard rummage after reading Pickwick. The mere thought reminds me that I'm starving. Is there any tidbit in the pantry, Queen Anne? I made a lemon pie this morning. You may have a piece of it. Phil dashed out to the pantry, and Anne betook herself to the orchard in company with Rusty. It was a moist, pleasantly odorous night in early spring. The snow was not quite all gone from the park. A little dingy bank of it yet lay under the pines of the harbour road, screened from the influence of April's suns. It kept the harbour road muddy and chilled the evening air, but grass was growing green in sheltered spots, and Gilbert had found some pale, sweet arbutus in a hidden corner. He came up from the park, his hands full of it. Anne was sitting on the big grey boulder in the orchard, looking at the poem of a bare birchen bough hanging against the pale red sunset with the very perfection of grace. She was building a castle in air, a wondrous mansion whose sunlit courts and stately halls were steeped in Araby's perfume, and where she reigned queen and chatelaine. She frowned as she saw Gilbert coming through the orchard. Of late she had managed not to be left alone with Gilbert, but he had caught her fairly now, and even Rusty had deserted her. Gilbert sat down beside her on the boulder and held out his mayflowers. "Don't these remind you of home and our old school-day picnics, Anne?" Anne took them and buried her face in them. "I'm in Mr. Silas Sloane's barrens this very minute," she said rapturously. "I suppose you will be there in reality in a few days." "No, not for a fortnight. I'm going to visit Phil in Bolingbroke before I go home. You'll be in Avonlea before I will." "No, I shall not be in Avonlea at all this summer, Anne. I've been offered a job in the Daily News office, and I'm going to take it." "Oh," said Anne vaguely. She wondered what a whole Avonlea summer would be like without Gilbert. Somehow she did not like the prospect. "Well," she concluded flatly, "it is a good thing for you, of course." "Yes, I've been hoping I would get it. It will help me out next year." "You mustn't work too hard," said Anne, without any very clear idea of what she was saying. She wished desperately that Phil would come out. "You've studied very constantly this winter. Isn't this a delightful evening? Do you know, I found a cluster of white violets under that old twisted tree over there today. I felt as if I had discovered a gold mine." "You're always discovering gold mines," said Gilbert, also absently. "Let us go and see if we can find some more," suggested Anne eagerly. "I'll call Phil and—" "Never mind Phil and the violets just now, Anne," said Gilbert quietly, taking her hand in a clasp from which she could not free it. "There is something I want to say to you." "Oh, don't say it," cried Anne pleadingly. "Don't, please, Gilbert." "I must. Things can't go on like this any longer. Anne, I love you. You know I do. I can't tell you how much. Will you promise me that someday you'll be my wife?" I can't," said Anne miserably. "Oh, Gilbert, you've spoiled everything." "Don't you care for me at all?" Gilbert asked after a very dreadful pause, during which Anne had not dared to look up. Not in that way. I do care a great deal for you as a friend, but I don't love you, Gilbert." "But can't you give me some hope that you will yet?" "No, I can't," exclaimed Anne desperately. "I never can love you in that way, Gilbert. You must never speak of this to me again." There was another pause, so long and so dreadful that Anne was driven at last to look up. Gilbert's face was white to the lips, and his eyes— but Anne shuddered and looked away. There was nothing romantic about this. Must proposals be either grotesque or horrible? Could she ever forget Gilbert's face? "Is there anybody else?" he asked at last in a low voice. No, said Anne eagerly. "I don't care for anyone like that. And I like you better than anyone else in the world, Gilbert. And we must go on being friends, Gilbert." Gilbert gave a bitter little laugh. "Friends. Your friendship can't satisfy me, Anne. I want your love, and you tell me I can never have that. I'm sorry. Forgive me, Gilbert, was all Anne could say. Where, oh where, were all the gracious and graceful speeches wherewith, in imagination, she had been wont to dismiss rejected suitors? Gilbert released her hand gently. There isn't anything to forgive. There have been times when I thought you did care. I've deceived myself, that's all. Goodbye, Anne. Anne got herself to her room, sat down on her window-seat behind the pines, and cried bitterly. She felt as if something incalculably precious had gone out of her life. It was Gilbert's friendship, of course. Oh, why must she lose it after this fashion? "What is the matter, honey?" asked Phil, coming in through the moonlit gloom. Anne did not answer. At that moment she wished Phil were 1,000 miles away. "I suppose you've gone and refused Gilbert Blythe. You are an idiot, Anne Shirley." "Do you call it idiotic to refuse to marry a man I don't love?" said Anne coldly, goaded to reply. "You don't know love when you see it. You've tricked something out with your imagination that you think love, and you expect the real thing to look like that. There, that's the first sensible thing I've ever said in my life. I wonder how I managed it." "Phil," pleaded Anne, "please go away and leave me alone for a little while. My world has tumbled into pieces. I want to reconstruct it." "Without any Gilbert in it?" said Phil, going. "A world without any Gilbert in it." Anne repeated the words drearily. Would it not be a very lonely, forlorn place? Well, it was all Gilbert's fault. He had spoiled their beautiful comradeship. She must just learn to live without it. End of chapter 20.
Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 21. Roses of Yesterday. The fortnight Anne spent in Bolingbroke was a very pleasant one, with a little undercurrent of vague pain and dissatisfaction running through it whenever she thought about Gilbert. There was not, however, much time to think about him. Mount Holly, the beautiful old Gordon homestead, was a very gay place, overrun by Phil's friends of both sexes. There was quite a bewildering succession of drives, dances, picnics, and boating parties, all expressively lumped together by Phil under the head of jamborees. Alec and Alonzo were so constantly on hand that Anne wondered if they ever did anything but dance attendance on that will-o'-the-wisp of a Phil. They were both nice, manly fellows, but Anne would not be drawn into any opinion as to which was the nicer. "And I depended so on you to help me make up my mind which of them I should promise to marry," mourned Phil. "You must do that for yourself. You are quite expert at making up your mind as to whom other people should marry," retorted Anne rather caustically. "Oh, that's a very different thing," said Phil truly. But the sweetest incident of Anne's sojourn in Bolingbroke was the visit to her birthplace, the little shabby yellow house in an out-of-the-way street she had so often dreamed about. She looked at it with delighted eyes as she and Phil turned in at the gate. "It's almost exactly as I've pictured it," she said. "There's no honeysuckle over the windows, but there is a lilac tree by the gate. And yes, there are muslin curtains in the windows. How glad I am it is still painted yellow." A very tall, very thin woman opened the door. "Yes, the Shirleys lived here 20 years ago," she said in answer to Anne's question. "They had it rented. I remember 'em. They both died of fever at onct. It was terrible sad. They left a baby. I guess it's dead long ago. It was a sickly thing. Old Thomas and his wife took it, as if they hadn't enough of their own." "It didn't die," said Anne, smiling. "I was that baby." "You don't say so! Why, you have grown," exclaimed the woman, as if she were much surprised that Anne was not still a baby. "Come to look at you, I see the resemblance. You're complected like your pa. He had red hair. But you favor your ma in your eyes and mouth. She was a nice little thing. My daughter went to school to her and was nigh crazy about her. They was buried in the one grave, and the school board put up a tombstone to them as a reward for faithful service. Will you come in?" "Will you let me go all over the house?" asked Anne eagerly. "Laws, yes, you can if you like. 'Twon't take you long. There ain't much of it. I keep it my man to build a new kitchen, but he ain't one of your hustlers. The parlor's in there, and there's 2 rooms upstairs. Just prowl about yourselves. I've got to see to the baby. The east room was the one you were born in. I remember your ma saying she loved to see the sunrise. And I mind hearing that you was born just as the sun was rising, and its light on your face was the first thing your ma saw." Anne went up the narrow stairs and into that little east room with a full heart. It was as a shrine to her. Here her mother had dreamed the exquisite happy dreams of anticipated motherhood. Here that red sunrise light had fallen over them both in the sacred hour of birth. Here her mother had died. Anne looked about her reverently, her eyes filled with tears. It was for her one of the jeweled hours of that life that gleam out radiantly forever in memory. "Just to think of it, Mother was younger than I am now when I was born," she whispered. When Anne went downstairs, the lady of the house met her in the hall. She held out a dusty little packet tied with faded blue ribbon. "Here's a bundle of old letters I found in that closet upstairs when I came here," she said. "I don't know what they are. I never bothered to look in 'em, but the address on the top one is Miss Bertha Willis, and that was your ma's maiden name. You can take 'em if you care to have 'em." "Oh, thank you," cried Anne, clasping the packet rapturously. "That was all that was in the house," said her hostess. "The furniture was all sold to pay the doctor bills, and Mrs. Thomas got your ma's clothes and little things. I reckon they didn't last long among that drove of Thomas youngsters. They was destructive young animals, as I mind 'em." "I haven't one thing that belonged to my mother," said Anne chokily. I can never thank you enough for these letters." "You're quite welcome. Laws, but your eyes is like your ma's. She could just about talk with hers. Your father was sort of homely, but awful nice. I mind hearing folks say when they was married that there never was two people more in love with each other. Poor creatures. They didn't live much longer, but they was awful happy while they was alive, and I suppose that counts for a good deal." Anne longed to get home to read her precious letters, but she made one little pilgrimage first. She went alone to the green corner of the old Bolingbroke cemetery, where her father and mother were buried, and left on their grave the white flowers she carried. Then she hastened back to Mount Holly, shut herself up in her room, and read the letters. Some were written by her father, some by her mother. There were not many, only a dozen in all, for Walter and Bertha Shirley had not been often separated during their courtship. The letters were yellow and faded and dim, blurred with the touch of passing years. No profound words of wisdom were traced on the stained and wrinkled pages, but only lines of love and trust. The sweetness of forgotten things clung to them, the far-off fond imaginings of those long-dead lovers. Bertha Shirley had possessed the gift of writing letters which embodied the charming personality of the writer in words and thoughts that retained their beauty and fragrance after the lapse of time. The letters were tender, intimate, sacred. To Anne the sweetest of all was the one written after her birth to the father on a brief absence. It was full of a proud young mother's accounts of baby, her cleverness, her brightness, her thousand sweetnesses. "I love her best when she is asleep, and better still when she is awake," Bertha Shirley had written in the postscript. Probably it was the last sentence she had ever penned. The end was very near for her. "This has been the most beautiful day of my life," Anne said to Phil that night. "I've found my father and mother. Those letters have made them real to me. I'm not an orphan any longer. I feel as if I had opened a book and found roses of yesterday, sweet and beloved, between its leaves." End of chapter 21. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 22. Spring and Anne return to Green Gables. The firelight shadows were dancing over the kitchen walls at Green Gables, for the spring evening was chilly. Through the open east window drifted in the subtly sweet voices of the night. Marilla was sitting by the fire, at least in body. In spirit she was roaming olden ways with feet grown young. Of late Marilla had thus spent many an hour, when she thought she should have been knitting for the twins. "I suppose I'm growing old," she said. Yet Marilla had changed but little in the past 9 years, save to grow something thinner and even more angular. There was a little more gray in the hair that was still twisted up in the same hard knot, with 2 hairpins. Were they the same hairpins? Still stuck through it. But her expression was very different. The something about the mouth which had hinted at a sense of humor had developed wonderfully. Her eyes were gentler and milder, her smile more frequent and tender. Marilla was thinking of her whole past life, her cramped but not unhappy childhood, the jealously hidden dreams and the blighted hopes of her girlhood, the long, gray, narrow, monotonous years of dull middle life that followed, and the coming of Anne, the vivid, imaginative, impetuous child with her heart of love and her world of fancy, bringing with her color and warmth and radiance, until the wilderness of existence had blossomed like the rose. Marilla felt that out of her 60 years she had lived only the 9 that had followed the advent of Anne, and Anne would be home tomorrow night. The kitchen door opened. Marilla looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Lynde. Anne stood before her, tall and starry-eyed, with her hands full of mayflowers and violets. "Anne Shirley!" exclaimed Marilla. For once in her life she was surprised out of her reserve. She caught her girl in her arms and crushed her and her flowers against her heart, kissing the bright hair and sweet face warmly. "I never looked for you till tomorrow night. How did you get from Carmody?" "Walked, dearest of Marillas. Haven't I done it a score of times in the Queen's days? The mailman is to bring my trunk tomorrow. I just got homesick all at once and came a day earlier. And oh, I've had such a lovely walk in the May twilight. I stopped by the Barrens and picked these mayflowers. I came through Violet Vale. It's just a big bowl full of violets now, the dear sky-tinted things. Smell them, Marilla. Drink them in." Marilla sniffed obligingly, but she was more interested in Anne than in drinking violets. "Sit down, child. You must be real tired. I'm going to get you some supper. There's a darling moonrise behind the hills tonight, Marilla, and oh, how the frogs sang me home from Carmody. I do love the music of the frogs. It seems bound up with all my happiest recollections of old spring evenings, and it always reminds me of the night I came here first. Do you remember it, Marilla?" "Well, yes," said Marilla with emphasis. "I'm not likely to forget it ever." "They used to sing so madly in the marsh and brook that year. I would listen to them at my window in the dusk and wonder how they could seem so glad and so sad at the same time. Oh, but it's good to be home again. Redmond was splendid and Bolingbroke delightful, but Green Gables is home." "Gilbert isn't coming home this summer, I hear," said Marilla. "No." Something in Anne's tone made Marilla glance at her sharply, but Anne was apparently absorbed in arranging her violets in a bowl. "See, aren't they sweet?" she went on hurriedly. "The year is a book, isn't it, Marilla? Spring's pages are written in mayflowers and violets, summer's in roses, autumn's in red maple leaves, and winter in holly and evergreen." "Did Gilbert do well in his examinations?" persisted Marilla. "Excellently well. He led his class. But where are the twins and Mrs. Lynde?" "Rachel and Dora are over at Mr. Harrison's. Davy is down at the Boulters'. I think I hear him coming now." Davy burst in, saw Anne, stopped, and then hurled himself upon her with a joyful yell. "Oh, Anne, ain't I glad to see you! Say, Anne, I've grown 2 inches since last fall. Mrs. Lynde measured me with her tape today, and say, Anne, see my front tooth? It's gone. Mrs. Lynde tied one end of a string to it and the other end to the door, and then shut the door. I sold it to Milty for 2 cents. Milty's collecting teeth." "What in the world does he want teeth for?" asked Marilla. "To make a necklace for playing Indian chief," explained Davy, climbing upon Anne's lap. "He's got 15 already, and everybody else has promised, so there's no use in the rest of us starting to collect too. I tell you the Boulters are great business people." "Were you a good boy at Mrs. Boulter's?" asked Marilla severely. "Yes, but say, Marilla, I'm tired of being good." "You'd get tired of being bad much sooner, Davy boy," said Anne. "Well, it'd be fun while it lasted, wouldn't it?" persisted Davy. "I could be sorry for it afterwards, couldn't I?" "Being sorry wouldn't do away with the consequences of being bad, Davy. Don't you remember the Sunday last summer when you ran away from Sunday school? You told me then that being bad wasn't worth while. What were you and Milty doing today?" "Oh, we fished and chased the cat and hunted for eggs and yelled at the echo. There's a great echo in the bush behind the Boulter barn. Say, what is Echo, Anne? I want to know." "Echo is a beautiful nymph, Davy, living far away in the woods and laughing at the world from among the hills." "What does she look like?" "Her hair and eyes are dark, but her neck and arms are white as snow. No mortal can ever see how fair she is. She is fleeter than a deer, and that mocking voice of hers is all we can know of her. You can hear her calling at night. You can hear her laughing under the stars, but you can never see her. She flies afar if you follow her, and laughs at you always just over the next hill." "Is that true, Anne, or is it a whopper?" demanded Davy, staring. "Davy," said Anne despairingly, "haven't you sense enough to distinguish between a fairy tale and a falsehood?" "Then what is it that sasses back from the Boulter bush? I want to know," insisted Davy. "When you're a little older, Davy, I'll explain it all to you." The mention of age evidently gave a new turn to Davy's thoughts, for after a few moments of reflection he whispered solemnly, "Anne, I'm going to be married." "When?" asked Anne with equal solemnity. "Oh, not until I'm grown up, of course." "Well, that's a relief, Davy. Who is the lady?" "Stella Fletcher. She's in my class at school. And say, Anne, she's the prettiest girl you ever saw. If I die before I grow up, you'll keep an eye on her, won't you?" "Davy Keefe, do stop talking such nonsense," said Marilla severely. "'Tisn't nonsense," protested Davy in an injured tone. "She's my promised wife, and if I was to die she'd be my promised widow, wouldn't she? And she hasn't got a soul to look after her except her old grandmother." "Come and have your supper, Anne," said Marilla, "and don't encourage that child in his absurd talk." Chapter 22. Anne of the Island by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 23. Paul Cannot Find the Rock People. Life was very pleasant in Avonlea that summer, although Anne, amid all her vacation joys, was haunted by a sense of something gone which should be there. She would not admit, even in her inmost reflections, that this was caused by Gilbert's absence. But when she had to walk home alone from prayer meetings and Avis powwows, while Diana and Fred and many other gay couples loitered along the dusky, starlit country roads, there was a queer, lonely ache in her heart which she could not explain away. Gilbert did not even write to her, as she thought he might have done. She knew he wrote to Diana occasionally, but she would not inquire about him, and Diana, supposing that Anne heard from him, volunteered no information. Gilbert's mother, who was a gay, frank, light-hearted lady, but not overburdened with tact, had a very embarrassing habit of asking Anne, always in a painfully distinct voice and always in the presence of a crowd, if she had heard from Gilbert lately. Poor Anne could only blush horribly and murmur, "Not very lately," which was taken by all, Mrs. Blythe included, to be merely a maidenly evasion. Apart from this, Anne enjoyed her summer. Priscilla came for a merry visit in June, and when she had gone, Mr. and Mrs. Irving, Paul and Charlotta the Fourth came home for July and August. Echo Lodge was the scene of gaieties once more, and the echoes over the river were kept busy mimicking the laughter that rang in the old garden behind the spruces. Miss Lavendar had not changed, except to grow even sweeter and prettier. Paul adored her, and the companionship between them was beautiful to see. "But I don't call her Mother just by itself," he explained to Anne. "You see, that name belongs just to my own little mother, and I can't give it to anyone else. You know, teacher. But I call her Mother Lavendar, and I love her next best to Father. I even love her a little better than you, teacher." "Which is just as it ought to be," answered Anne. Paul was 13 now, and very tall for his years. His face and eyes were as beautiful as ever, and his fancy was still like a prism, separating everything that fell upon it into rainbows. He and Anne had delightful rambles to wood and field and shore. Never were there two more thoroughly kindred spirits. Charlotta the Fourth had blossomed out into young ladyhood. She wore her hair now in an enormous pompadour, and had discarded the blue ribbon bows of auld lang syne, but her face was as freckled, her nose as snubbed, and her mouth and smiles as wide as ever. "You don't think I talk with a Yankee accent, do you, Miss Shirley, ma'am?" she demanded anxiously. "I don't notice it, Charlotta." "I'm real glad of that. They said I did at home, but I thought likely they just wanted to aggravate me. I don't want no Yankee accent. Not that I've a word to say against the Yankees, Miss Shirley, ma'am. They're real civilized. But give me old P.E. Island every time." Paul spent his first fortnight with his grandmother Irving in Avonlea. Anne was there to meet him when he came, and found him wild with eagerness to get to the shore. Nora and the Golden Lady and the twin sailors would be there. He could hardly wait to eat his supper. Could he not see Nora's elfin face peering around the point, watching for him wistfully? But it was a very sober Paul who came back from the shore in the twilight. "Didn't you find your rock people?" asked Anne. Paul shook his chestnut curls sorrowfully. "The twin sailors and the Golden Lady never came at all," he said. "Nora was there, but Nora's not the same, teacher. She's changed." "Oh, Paul, it is you who are changed," said Anne. "You have grown too old for the rock people. They like only children for playfellows. I am afraid the twin sailors will never again come to you in the pearly, enchanted boat with the sail of moonshine, and the Golden Lady will play no more for you on her golden harp. Even Nora will not meet you much longer. You must pay the penalty of growing up, Paul. You must leave Fairyland behind you." "You two talk as much foolishness as you ever did," said old Mrs. Irving, half indulgently, half reprovingly. "Oh, no, we don't," said Anne, shaking her head gravely. "We are getting very, very wise, and it is such a pity. We are never half so interesting when we have learned that language is given us to enable us to conceal our thoughts." "But it isn't. It is given us to exchange our thoughts," said Mrs. Irving seriously. She had never heard of Talleyrand, and did not understand epigrams. Anne spent a fortnight of halcyon days at Echo Lodge in the golden prime of August. While there she incidentally contrived to hurry Ludovic Speed in his leisurely courting of Theodora Dix, as related duly in another chronicle of her history. Arnold Sherman, an elderly friend of the Irvings, was there at the same time, and added not a little to the general pleasantness of life. "What a nice playtime this has been," said Anne. "I feel like a giant refreshed, and it's only a fortnight more till I go back to Kingsport and Redmond and Patty's Place. Patty's Place is the dearest spot, Miss Lavendar. I feel as if I had two homes, one at Green Gables and one at Patty's Place. But where has the summer gone? It doesn't seem a day since I came home that spring evening with the Mayflowers. When I was little I couldn't see from one end of the summer to the other. It stretched before me like an unending season. Now 'tis a handbreadth, 'tis a tale. Anne, are you and Gilbert Blythe as good friends as you used to be? Asked Miss Lavendar quietly. I am just as much Gilbert's friend as ever I was, Miss Lavendar. Miss Lavendar shook her head. I see something's gone wrong, Anne. I'm going to be impertinent and ask what. Have you quarrelled? No, it's only that Gilbert wants more than friendship, and I can't give him more. Are you sure of that, Anne? Perfectly sure. I'm very, very sorry. I wonder why everybody seems to think I ought to marry Gilbert Blythe, said Anne petulantly. Because you were made and meant for each other, Anne, that is why. You needn't toss that young head of yours, it's a fact. End of chapter 23.